The heart monitor flatlined at 11:47 p.m., and every doctor in that trauma bay froze. A decorated Marine officer, unconscious, bleeding out, chest caving, lay on the table while three senior surgeons stood motionless, staring at each other like they were waiting for permission from someone who wasn't coming. Then a young blonde nurse stepped forward from the back of the room, grabbed the emergency kit off the wall, and said quietly, "I've seen this before." Nobody moved to help her. Nobody believed she could do what came next. At Crestview Medical Center in Portland, Oregon, Nora Callahan was the nurse everyone underestimated. The one they assigned the worst shifts, the one they talked over in briefings, the one the chief of trauma surgery had publicly called dangerously overconfident in front of the entire ER floor. What none of them knew was about to change everything. Before we go further, if you've ever watched someone get dismissed for knowing more than the person dismissing them, you're going to want to stay for this entire story. Hit that subscribe button right now because we release new stories every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Portland in February was the kind of cold that came sideways. Rain that didn't fall so much as materialize in the air around you, soaking through jackets and settling into bones. Crestview Medical Center sat at the edge of the Pearl District, a 12-floor glass and steel building that tried hard to look modern and mostly succeeded, except for the loading dock on the south side, where the emergency generators were held together with electrical tape and someone's good intentions. Nora Callahan knew every inch of that building. She had worked there for 14 months, and in that time she had memorized the broken supply cabinet in Trauma Bay 2 that required a specific kick to open, the elevator that ran 30 seconds slower than its counterpart, the shift rotation gaps that left the ICU undersupported on Tuesday nights. She knew these things not because she was nosy, but because knowing them was the only way to do her job right when the system around her was not doing its job at all. She was 31 years old, medium height, with blonde hair she kept pulled back so tight it looked almost severe. Her eyes were gray-green and steady in a way that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. The kind of steady that came not from calm temperament, but from years of training yourself not to react when every instinct was screaming. She had been a U.S. Army combat medic for 8 years before she ever set foot inside a civilian hospital. Attached to a special operations evacuation unit, she had worked in places where the nearest surgical team was a 40-minute helicopter ride away, and the patient in front of you had maybe 12 minutes. She had placed chest tubes in the dark. She had managed tension pneumothorax while wearing body armor in a vehicle that was still moving. She had performed procedures that most ER nurses in the country would never see once in their careers, and she had done them without equipment, without backup, and sometimes while someone was shooting at her. She did not talk about any of this at Crestview. She had learned quickly that her military background did not impress the senior physicians on staff. It irritated them. It implied she thought she knew things. It implied she might disagree. Dr. Leonard Voss was the chief of trauma surgery, and from the first week Nora arrived at Crestview, he had made his opinion of her abundantly clear. Voss was 53, heavy-set, with thick silver hair he kept neatly parted, and an air of absolute authority that he wore like a second skin. He had trained at Johns Hopkins, completed a fellowship at Mass General, and had spent the last 11 years building Crestview's trauma program into something that looked excellent on paper and mostly functioned well in practice. He was technically skilled. He was also, without question, the most casually cruel person Nora had ever worked with. Nurse Callahan. He had used her name like punctuation from the very beginning. Nurse Callahan, this is not your call. Or, Nurse Callahan, perhaps you could focus on tasks within your scope. Or, in front of 7 other staff members during a morning briefing 3 months ago. I think what we're seeing here is the classic problem with people who come from military medicine. They learn to improvise because the environment demands it. But improvisation is not medicine. It's guesswork under pressure. We don't do that here. Nobody had defended her. She hadn't expected them to. Nora had spent her career in institutions where what mattered was what you could do when everything went wrong. Crestview was an institution where what mattered was what your credentials said you could do, and who had signed off on saying it. These were different things, and the gap between them had cost patients before, and it would cost them again. And Nora understood that she could not fix this by arguing with Leonard Voss in a hallway. She could only do her job document everything carefully, and wait. She was good at waiting. The first time the gap between what she knew and what she was allowed to do nearly killed someone, it was a Tuesday. A 26-year-old named Marcus Webb had come in through the ER after a car accident, airbag deployment, seatbelt sign across his abdomen, vitals that initially looked manageable. The attending on duty had ordered standard imaging and observation. Nora had watched Marcus for 2 hours, tracking the slow creep of his blood pressure downward, the subtle distension developing in his left flank, the way his pain had migrated from diffuse to localized in a pattern she recognized. She pulled up his chart and flagged the attending 3 times before she finally said it directly. He's bleeding. Splenic laceration, probably grade 3. He needs a repeat fast, and he needs it now. The attending, a second-year resident named Dr. Fiona Park, who was already exhausted and overextended, had looked at the chart and looked at Nora and said, "His vitals are borderline but stable." "They won't be in 20 minutes. Park had hesitated. Then she had gone to find Voss. Voss had come out to the hallway and looked at Nora the way someone looks at a malfunctioning piece of equipment they're deciding whether to repair or replace. "What is the basis for this assessment, Nurse Callahan?" "Clinical presentation. His pressure has dropped 6 points in 90 minutes. Tenderness on palpation is localizing. The trajectory, Voss said, cutting her off, is being monitored by the attending physician. I appreciate your concern. Please return to your assigned patients." 34 minutes later, Marcus Webb's blood pressure crashed. The repeat fast showed a significant splenic bleed. He went to surgery immediately and nearly didn't make it off the table. Afterward, Voss had pulled Nora aside. She had expected a reprimand. Instead, what she got was something more surgical. "You were right about the patient," he said. "That doesn't mean you were right to push the way you did. You undermined Dr. Park's authority with a patient she was responsible for. You created confusion in the care team. That is a safety issue, regardless of outcome." Nora looked at him. "If I hadn't pushed, Marcus Webb would be dead." "That's not a conclusion you're qualified to draw." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know what I saw." "I'm sure you believe that." He straightened his coat. "Consider this a formal counseling. If there's a next time, it goes in your file." She walked back to the nursing station and spent the next 4 hours doing her job without saying a word that wasn't strictly required. The thing about being underestimated by smart people was that they thought they were simply being accurate. Voss did not believe he was punishing her. He believed he was managing a staffing liability. A nurse with an inflated sense of her own capabilities. A product of a different system with different standards. Someone who needed to be kept in her lane for everyone's safety, including her own. He had constructed a complete picture of who she was and what she represented, and the picture was so coherent to him that no evidence that contradicted it could find any purchase. She had seen that dynamic before. In the Army, it usually came from officers who had never been in the field. They were never malicious. They just had no framework for what they hadn't witnessed themselves. The difference was that in the Army, the people she worked directly with had seen what she could do. At Crestview, no one had. Not yet. The second incident happened 6 weeks later, and it was worse. A pediatric transfer had come in from a smaller hospital to the south. A 14-year-old girl named Becca Osei, who had been admitted for what the referring physician had diagnosed as a severe asthma exacerbation. She had been on nebulized albuterol for 8 hours with minimal response. Her oxygen saturation was holding at 91% on 6 liters, and the transfer notes were vague in a way that worried Nora the moment she read them. She took the handoff from the transport team, got Becca settled, and started working through the assessment in her head, even as she was completing the physical checks. The breath sounds were uneven in a way that didn't match asthma. Not the diffuse wheeze she expected, but something more lateralized, more mechanical. She leaned in and asked Becca quietly whether she'd eaten anything unusual, touched anything unusual, whether anything had happened right before she started having trouble breathing. Becca, exhausted and frightened, said she'd been helping her older brother sort through their grandfather's storage unit the day before. Nora spent the next 4 minutes getting the most complete history she could out of a tired teenager, and then she walked to the nursing station and pulled Dr. Voss's resident, a third-year named Caleb Torres. "I think the Osei girl has a foreign body obstruction," she told him. Possibly a small object she aspirated during exposure to the storage unit. The lateralized breath sounds, the non-response to bronchodilators. The history, It fits. Torres frowned. The transfer diagnosis is asthma exacerbation. I know what the transfer diagnosis is. Nurse Callahan, run a chest fluoroscopy before you increase the albuterol dose. If I'm wrong, you've lost 15 minutes. If I'm right, you've avoided an iatrogenic complication. Torres had gone to Voss. Voss had come out, reviewed the transfer notes, looked at Becca's chart, and looked at Nora. This is a straightforward asthma case that was undertreated at the transferring facility, he said. The breath sounds don't support that. I will be the one assessing the breath sounds. His voice was very even. And I will remind you, for what I hope is the last time, that initiating diagnostic pathways is not within your scope of practice. You are here to support the care plan, not to create one. He walked into the room to see Becca. 12 minutes later, he came back out with a different expression. He ordered the fluoroscopy. It showed a small metal washer lodged in the right main bronchus. Becca went to interventional pulmonology, had it extracted under bronchoscopy, and was breathing normally within 2 hours. Voss did not acknowledge Nora. He did not look at her. He simply revised the care plan and moved on. She heard later, through Torres, who felt guilty enough to mention it, that Voss had documented the identification of the foreign body obstruction as a clinical finding made during his own assessment. Her name was not in the note. She had expected that too. What she had not expected was what happened at the following week's department meeting, when Voss stood in front of the assembled trauma staff and said, "We had a near miss last week with a transfer case. I want to use it as a teaching moment about diagnostic anchoring, the danger of accepting the referring physician's diagnosis without independent assessment." He walked through the case without naming names, including his own delay, without mentioning the nursing assessment that had flagged the correct diagnosis, presenting it as an example of physician vigilance catching a near miss. Nora sat in the back of the room. She looked at her hands. She thought about the combat medic rotation she had done in her 3rd year of service, working with a Special Forces ODA team in a forward operating base, where the team sergeant had told her, "I don't care what your rank says. I care what you can do when the moment comes. Show me that. The rank will sort itself out." The rank had not sorted itself out at Crestview, but she was still here, and she was still paying attention. The night everything changed came on a Thursday in early March, when Portland was in the grip of an ice storm that had shut down 2 highway systems and was straining the city's emergency response infrastructure in ways the news was calling unprecedented and the ER staff was calling a catastrophe. Nora was 90 minutes into a double shift she had picked up to cover a sick call, working the trauma floor, with a team that was already running on fumes. 2 nurses down, 1 attending backed up with a complex case in Bay 1, the waiting room spilling past the admissions desk. At 9:22 p.m., the radio crackling at the nurses' station picked up a transmission from a medevac inbound from the I-205 corridor. The dispatcher's voice was clipped and fast. Multiple vehicle incident, Priority 1 transport, patient male, late 50s, blunt trauma to the chest and abdomen, vitals declining, ETA 14 minutes. Standard enough, except for the second transmission that came through 30 seconds later. Nora heard it through the ambient noise of the floor. A shift supervisor on another channel, voice dropped low, saying something about military escort and federal notification and a name she couldn't quite catch. She filed it away and kept moving. The medevac landed on the rooftop pad at 9:38 p.m. By the time the gurney came off the elevator and through the trauma doors, there were already 6 people in the bay prepping equipment, and Nora could see immediately, from across the room, that something was wrong with the assessment happening in real time. The patient was a large man, mid to late 50s, silver-haired, in the kind of physical condition that suggested someone who had not stopped training just because they had a desk. He was unconscious. His BP on the transport readout was 74/40 and falling. His airway was intact, but his breathing was labored in a pattern that Nora read before she even got close. Rapid, shallow, the chest rising asymmetrically. Dr. Voss arrived 40 seconds behind the gurney, still buttoning his coat, took one look, and called for bilateral large-bore IV access, and started ordering a workup that made clinical sense if you were looking at a straightforward trauma with hemodynamic compromise. But Nora was watching the chest. The transport medic, a veteran paramedic named Ruiz, who had been in the field for 20 years, caught her eye across the gurney. He gave a small nod toward the patient's left side. She moved around the bay. The diminished breath sounds on the left were subtle. Subtle enough that in a noisy trauma bay with monitors alarming and 4 people moving around the patient, a physician focused on the hemodynamic picture could miss them on a quick auscultation. The trachea had shifted 2 centimeters to the right. The neck veins, even in a hypotensive patient, were distended. She knew what this was. She had seen it 6 times, treated it 4. Dr. Voss. She kept her voice level. I think he's got a tension pneumo on the left. Blood pressure is the primary concern right now, Nurse Callahan. Get me that IV access. His pressure is low because his chest is collapsing. The tension is impeding cardiac return. Fluids won't hold. Voss looked up from the head of the bed. I will remind you. Tracheal deviation, JVD. Absent breath sounds on the left. His pressure dropped another 6 points in the last 90 seconds. She pointed at the monitor. That's the 3rd reading. The room was briefly very quiet. Torres, who was on the team tonight, looked at the monitor, then looked at the patient's neck. His expression shifted. Dr. Voss, Torres said carefully, the trachea does look. I can see the patient, Torres. Voss moved to the left side of the gurney and placed his stethoscope. Listened. His jaw tightened. He listened again. Nora watched him. What she was watching was not uncertainty about the diagnosis. She could see from the set of his shoulders that he had heard it, or rather, hadn't heard it, the silence on that side that should not have been silence. What she was watching was a man deciding how to proceed in a way that preserved his authority even while acting on information someone else had provided. Prepare for needle decompression, Voss said to Torres. Left second intercostal, mid-clavicular. He did not look at Nora. She had already pulled the supplies. She placed them on the instrument tray without being asked, laid them out in the sequence the procedure required, and stepped back to the monitoring position, because she understood the choreography of this room, and she understood that her role in it was not going to change tonight, regardless of what she knew. Torres performed the decompression. The rush of air was audible even over the monitors. The patient's blood pressure jumped 17 points in 40 seconds. The room exhaled. And then the trauma bay doors opened, and the night stopped being about medicine at all. There were 4 of them. 3 in Marine Corps service uniforms, 1 in civilian clothes with a federal badge clipped to his belt. They did not run. They moved the way people move when they have been trained to project controlled authority in high-stress environments, which is to say, they moved quickly but without urgency, because urgency suggests things are out of control, and these people did not operate under that assumption. The man in civilian clothes showed his badge to the charge nurse and said something Nora couldn't hear. The charge nurse pointed at the trauma bay. The 4 men positioned themselves outside the bay doors. The attending on duty, Dr. Sandra Marsh, who had been handling the Bay 1 case and had come in to assist, leaned out into the hall and had a brief conversation with the civilian badge. And when she came back, her expression was different than when she'd left. "Who is this patient?" Marsh asked Ruiz, the transport paramedic. Ruiz looked at the doorway, then at the patient, then back at Marsh. "I was told the family would be notified before the team was briefed. That's not how this works in my trauma bay." Ruiz lowered his voice. "Ma'am, the patient is Brigadier General Aaron Strickland. He's the Commanding General of Marine Forces Special Operations Command." The room went very still. Nora looked at the man on the table. She looked at the silver hair, the specific physical build, the hands that were the hands of someone who had done hard physical work for most of his life and hadn't stopped. She had never met Aaron Strickland, but she knew the name. Everyone who had served in Special Operations medical support in the last decade knew the name, because Strickland was the general who had pushed through the expansion of the Special Operations Combat Medic program, the one who had fought the institutional resistance to giving combat medics expanded procedural authority, the one who had stood in front of a Senate subcommittee and said, on the record, "The people who save lives in the field are not the people with the most credentials. They are the people with the most training and the most experience. We should stop pretending those 2 things are the same." Nora had read that testimony twice when it was published. She had never expected to be in the same room as the man who gave it. The monitor alarmed. Strickland's pressure was dropping again. The needle decompression had bought time, but the underlying issue was still there. A tension that had partially resolved but not fully, and a hemodynamic picture that was not stabilizing the way it should. Nora read the numbers as they scrolled. The map was trending down. The heart rate was climbing to compensate. The breathing pattern was still labored. She moved to the airway cart without being asked, and began checking the thoracic equipment. "What are you doing?" Voss said. "Preparing for tube thoracostomy," she said. "The decompression bought time, but it's not holding. I make that determination." "I know." She kept her hands moving. "And when you're ready, the equipment will be here." Voss looked at the monitor. The map dropped another 4 points. He looked at Torres. "Tube thoracostomy," he said. "Left lateral decubitus position, if we can, or modified supine. Let's move." He did not look at Nora. She handed him the equipment in the order he needed it. At 10:17 p.m., with a Marine general's chest open to a chest tube and his blood pressure finally beginning to stabilize, one of the men in uniform outside the bay pushed the door open and looked in. He was older than the others. Not old, maybe mid-50s, with a face that had been weathered in a specific way that Nora associated with people who had spent years in high-altitude, high-temperature, or high-stress environments, which frequently meant all three. He wore the uniform of a lieutenant general. He looked at the patient on the table, and something in his face went very controlled, very fast in the way that people control themselves when they cannot afford to react. Then his eyes moved across the room. They passed over Voss, passed over Torres, passed over the equipment and the monitors and the 2 other nurses working the bay, and stopped on Nora. She was standing at the instrument tray, gloved, focused on the procedure, not paying attention to the door. She felt the weight of the look before she registered it, and when she looked up, the lieutenant general was watching her with an expression she couldn't read from across the room. She looked back down at the instrument tray. The procedure continued. At 10:31 p.m., Aaron Strickland's vitals reached the first stable plateau of the night. Not safe, not out of danger, but no longer in free fall. Voss stepped back from the table and began issuing post-stabilization orders. Torres was documenting. The other nurses were moving the patient toward imaging prep. The room was transitioning from crisis to controlled care, the way it always did after the immediate danger passed. Slower, more deliberate, people breathing through their mouths. Nora was stripping her gloves when she heard the door. The lieutenant general had come into the bay. He was looking at her again. "Nurse," he said. Not her name, just the word, used the way a person uses a word when they're not sure it's the right one. She turned to face him. Up close, the weathering she'd noticed was more pronounced. Sun damage across the forehead and the back of the hands, the specific thinning around the eyes that came from years of squinting in bright, uncontrolled light. The uniform was precise. The posture was the kind of thing that didn't turn off. "Yes, sir," she said, because she had spent 8 years defaulting to that phrase, and it came out before she thought about it. Something shifted in his face. Not recognition. Not yet. Something earlier than that. The beginning of a question forming. "How long have you been at this hospital?" he asked. 14 months. He looked at her hands, at the way she was standing, at something she couldn't identify that he seemed to be cataloging. "Where before that?" She held his gaze. "I don't see how that's relevant to the patient's care, sir." "It might be," he said, "more relevant than you think." The monitor behind her alarmed. She turned, checked the readout, made the call to the nurse at the bedside, and by the time she looked back at the doorway, the lieutenant general had stepped back into the hall. But he hadn't left. She could see him through the bay window, standing with his hands behind his back, watching. And she had the sudden, specific, deeply unsettling feeling that the night was not over, that what had just happened in this room was not the main event, but only the thing that had been required to happen before the main event could begin. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. She went back to work. At 11:02 p.m., Dr. Voss appeared at her elbow. "The general will be moved to the surgical ICU once imaging is complete," he said. "You'll hand off to the night team." "Yes," she said. The care tonight was within acceptable parameters, he said, which was, she understood, as close as Leonard Voss was capable of coming to an acknowledgement that things had gone correctly. The needle decompression assessment was a reasonable observation. She looked at him. "It was the right call," she said. His jaw moved slightly. "Yes, it was timely." He straightened his coat. "Don't mistake timeliness for license." He walked away. She watched him go. Through the bay window, the lieutenant general was still watching. She finished her documentation, changed out of her trauma gear, and was at the nurse's station writing up the handoff notes when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It wasn't the lieutenant general. It was Ruiz, the transport paramedic, who had stayed to complete his own paperwork and was now looking at her with an expression she recognized as the look of someone about to say something they're not sure they should say. "You were Army," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "SOF medical support?" She paused. "Something like that." He nodded slowly. "The lieutenant general outside. You know who he is?" "I know his rank." "His name is Garrett Wills," Ruiz said. "He's the deputy commander of Marine Forces Command. He's been in country for 3 days. He flew in when they got word about Strickland." He looked at her carefully. "He's been asking about you." The pen in her hand went still. "What do you mean, asking about me?" "Asking the charge nurse. Asking me." Ruiz kept his voice low. "Specifically, he wanted to know your name and your background and how long you'd been at Crestview and where you were before." She set down the pen. "I don't know him," she said. "He might know you," Ruiz said, "or know of you. He kept looking at you during the procedure like—" He stopped. "Like he was trying to place something." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Just thought you should know." He picked up his paperwork. "Whatever it is, it's not finished." He was right. At 11:47 p.m., when the trauma bay had cleared and the night team was settling in, and Nora was 20 minutes from the end of a shift that had already lasted 16 hours, the charge nurse appeared at her station. Nurse Callahan. The charge nurse, a solid, experienced woman named Deb Forsyth, who had been at Crestview for 19 years and had seen most things, looked slightly off balance in a way that Nora associated with news that was difficult to categorize. "There's someone in the family consultation room asking for you by name." "Who?" "Lieutenant General Wills." Deb paused. "And 2 men I don't recognize who showed identification to security and were waved through." Another pause. "Military intelligence." Nora felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear exactly, and not surprise exactly, but the specific alertness that came from realizing a situation had just expanded beyond its apparent borders. "Okay," she said. She walked down the hall toward the consultation room. She thought about what Ruiz had said, about being placed, about someone looking at her like they were trying to remember something. She thought about 8 years she had spent trying to disappear quietly into a different life. She put her hand on the door handle. She pushed it open. Lieutenant General Garrett Wills was standing at the window, hands behind his back, looking out at the rain-slicked parking structure. He turned when she came in. The 2 men she didn't recognize were seated at the table, which meant they were not the ones running this conversation. Wills looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You kept Aaron Strickland alive tonight." "The surgical team kept him alive," she said. "That's not what I saw." He took one step toward her. "I was watching through that window for 20 minutes. I saw you identify the tension before the physicians did. I saw you lay out the thoracostomy equipment before the order was given. I saw you manage that room the way someone manages a room when they've been in worse rooms and survived." He stopped. "So I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." She waited. "Before Crestview," he said. "Before nursing school. Were you with the 75th Support Battalion, attached to ODA rotations in the Kandahar sector between 2013 and 2016? The rain hit the window. The fluorescent light in the consultation room hummed. Nora looked at Garrett Wills and felt, very clearly, the ground shifting under everything she had built in the 14 months since she'd walked into this hospital and told herself she was starting over. "Why are you asking me that?" she said. He reached into his jacket and placed a photograph on the table. It was a field photograph, taken in harsh outdoor light, slightly overexposed in the way of cameras working in extreme brightness. It showed a forward operating base. She recognized the layout, the barriers, the specific configuration of medical tents. And in the foreground, 2 figures in full kit, one of them clearly injured, the other crouched over them, working. The one who was working was small, blonde, moving with the specific economy of motion that came from doing a high-stakes procedure under time pressure. She looked at the photograph for a long time. "Where did you get that?" she said. "It was in Aaron Strickland's personal file," Wills said quietly. "He kept it because the medic in that photograph saved the life of a soldier from his unit. A soldier who would have died before the evac bird arrived." He paused. "He never knew the medic's name, The FOB records from that rotation were incomplete, but he kept the photograph because he wanted to find her someday and tell her personally. Nora looked up from the photograph. He found her, Wills said. She stood very still. Outside in the hallway, she could hear the ordinary sounds of a hospital night: footsteps, a cartwheel, a distant monitor, someone's voice too far away to make out. The ordinary machinery of a place where people came when they had run out of other options. She had thought she had left the other world behind. She was beginning to understand that it had simply been waiting. "I need to know something," she said. Wills waited. "Is General Strickland going to survive the night?" Wills held her gaze. "The surgeons say his prognosis is guarded but stable. The actions taken in that trauma bay tonight were the difference." He paused. "Including yours." She nodded slowly. "Then we can talk," she said. She pulled out a chair. She sat down. And in the consultation room at the end of the hall at Crestview Medical Center, while the ice storm moved through Portland and the ER kept running, and Leonard Voss wrote his patient notes without her name in any of them, Nora Callahan began, for the first time in 14 months, to tell the truth about who she was. She didn't know yet what that truth was going to cost her. She didn't know yet what it was going to change. She only knew that the man in that photograph on the table was alive because of what she had done tonight, and that the world she thought she had left behind had just walked back through the door wearing a uniform and a question she could no longer avoid answering. She looked at Wills. "How much do you need to know?" she said. He looked back at her steadily. "All of it," he said. She told him 3 hours worth of it, which was not all of it, but was enough. Wills sat across the table and listened the way experienced military officers listened, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, tracking everything and filing it, his eyes steady on her face. The two men she didn't recognize took no notes. They didn't need to. She understood, looking at them, that they were the kind of people for whom note-taking was already handled by other means. She told him about the enlistment at 22, after 2 years of pre-med that she'd been paying for herself and couldn't sustain financially. She told him about the combat medic pipeline, the 18 weeks of training at Fort Sam Houston, the follow-on courses, the attachments that came after she tested into the top 3% of her class and got flagged for special operations support. She told him about this first rotation, which had been unremarkable in the way that first rotations were unremarkable. Long stretches of logistics punctuated by brief, violent moments that rearranged your understanding of what the human body could survive. She told him about the third rotation, the one that included the FOB in the photograph. She did not tell him everything about that rotation. Some of it was still classified, or had been when she left the service, and she wasn't going to assume the classification had expired just because a lieutenant general was sitting across a table from her looking patient and trustworthy. Wills didn't push on the gaps. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You left the service in 2018, he said. "Yes." "Medical discharge?" "Voluntary separation." He looked at her in a way that suggested he knew there was more to that sentence and was choosing not to pull on it tonight. "You went straight into the nursing program?" "Accelerated BSN, 18 months. She had spent those 18 months at a program in Spokane, living in a studio apartment, working the overnight shift at a convenience store to supplement the GI Bill funds, studying during the dead hours between midnight and 6 a.m. It had not been difficult exactly. The clinical material was familiar. The difficulty had been something else, the specific disorientation of sitting in a classroom learning procedures she had already performed under conditions the instructors would not have believed if she'd described them. "Why nursing?" Wills asked. "With your background, you could have gone to PA school, med school, with the right support." "Nursing gets you to the patient faster," she said, "and I was tired of waiting on other people's permission to do what needed doing." Something in his expression shifted very slightly. "And then you ended up here." "I ended up here, working under Leonard Voss." She looked at him carefully. "You know Dr. Voss?" "I know of him. The hospital's reputation in trauma care is partly built on his program." He paused. "The rest of what I know about him is based on the last 3 hours of asking people questions." She didn't ask what they'd told him. She could guess, and she wasn't sure she wanted it confirmed right now, in this room, by a lieutenant general who had just watched her nearly have her career ended for identifying a correct diagnosis too loudly. "What happens now?" she said. "Tonight? Nothing. General Strickland is stable. He'll be in the surgical ICU for the next several days minimum." Wills folded his hands on the table. What happens after that depends on a number of things, including whether certain people in this hospital are made aware of the full picture of what happened in that trauma bay tonight. He held her gaze. And whether you want them to be. She thought about that. She thought about the 14 months of documentation she had kept, not for this purpose, not for any purpose she could have articulated, but because keeping records was something she had been trained to do and the habit had never left her. Every incident, every flagged observation, every instance of an order she had recommended that was initially rejected and subsequently proven correct. She had not shown the documentation to anyone. She had not planned to. I need to think, she said. That's fair. He stood. We're not going anywhere. Strickland's people will be in and out of this hospital for as long as he's here. I'll be in the city. He picked up the photograph from the table, looked at it for a moment, then set it back down. That's yours. He'd want you to have it. She looked at the photograph. She did not pick it up. Not yet. She went home at 2 in the morning, drove through rain that had become sleet, and sat in her apartment for 40 minutes without turning on the lights, working through the situation the way she worked through clinical problems, systematically, without sentimentality, trying to identify what she knew, what she didn't know, and what the possible outcomes looked like depending on which path she chose. She knew Strickland was alive. She knew Wills had information about her service record that could reframe everything that had happened in the last 14 months at Crestview. She knew that reframing came with costs she hadn't fully calculated yet. And she knew, this was the part she kept coming back to, that she had done nothing tonight that she needed to be ashamed of. She had identified a tension pneumothorax in a deteriorating patient. She had prepared the equipment for a procedure. She had supported the team that saved the man's life. These were not extraordinary things. They were simply the things she was capable of doing and had done. The extraordinary part was that nobody in that room had expected her to be capable of them. She was used to that. She was used to it in the way that people get used to low-grade physical pain. Not comfortably, not without awareness, but as a background condition they've stopped expecting to change. She slept 3 hours. Woke up, made coffee, and went back to work. The Thursday morning shift at Crestview began the way most shifts began, with a briefing that ran over time, a supply cart that was missing 2 items it was supposed to contain, and a waiting room that had been accumulating patients since the previous evening because the ice storm had made transport difficult, and people had been waiting to see whether their problems were serious enough to justify the drive. Nora worked the floor the way she always worked, efficiently, without drawing attention, taking the cases she was assigned and doing them correctly and completely, managing the gaps in coverage without being asked because the gaps were obvious to anyone paying attention, and she was always paying attention. At 9:43 a.m., Dr. Voss walked onto the floor and the ambient temperature of the nursing station dropped approximately 3 degrees. He came straight to her. "Nurse Callahan." He kept his voice low, which was worse than when he used his normal volume, because low meant contained, and contained meant something had happened that he was working hard not to react visibly to. "My office. When you have a moment." She had a moment in 11 minutes, which was how long it took her to complete the assessment she was in the middle of and hand the patient off to the next nurse. She walked to Voss's office, knocked, and went in. He was standing behind his desk, not sitting, standing with his hands in his coat pockets, which was a posture she had never seen him take before. "I understand," he said, "that you had a meeting last night with military personnel following the Strickland case." "I did," she said, without notifying the department chief or the charge physician on duty. "The meeting was requested by Lieutenant General Wills. He asked to speak with me in the consultation room. It wasn't a clinical meeting. It took place in this hospital. It took place in a consultation room at 11:50 p.m. at the end of my shift, after the patient had been moved to the SICU. She kept her voice even. "I wasn't aware I needed departmental approval for a conversation." Voss looked at her. She could see him calibrating. He was angry, but he was also something else, something she hadn't seen in his face before, and it took her a moment to identify it. Not fear exactly, more like the specific wariness of a man who had realized that a situation had dimensions he hadn't mapped yet and wasn't sure how to proceed without that map. "What did they discuss with you?" "That's between me and them." His eyes narrowed. "I am the chief of trauma surgery at this hospital. When military personnel come to this facility and conduct meetings with my staff regarding incidents that occurred in my department, I have a right to be informed. You should take that up with Lieutenant General Wills, she said. I can give you his contact information if you'd like. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which in a conversation with Leonard Voss was a long time. You're on modified duty for the next 48 hours, he said, pending a review of last night's incident. She looked at him steadily. What incident? Your behavior in Trauma Bay 1. The unauthorized attempts to redirect the clinical assessment. He stopped himself. Recalibrated. There is a process for reviewing significant cases. This is part of that process. She said nothing. You may return to your standard assignment, he said. The modified duty means you are not to be assigned to active trauma cases until the review is complete. She nodded once. She went back to the floor. For the next 6 hours, she worked general medical cases, wound management, IV maintenance, patient education, documentation, the 10,000 smaller tasks that made up the invisible infrastructure of a functioning hospital floor. She did them carefully. She did them without complaint. She answered every question she was asked and did not volunteer information she wasn't asked for. At 2:15 p.m., her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a number she didn't have saved, but the area code was local. She stepped into the supply corridor and answered, Nurse Callahan. It was Wills. General Strickland is awake. She pressed her back against the shelving. That's faster than expected. He's motivated, Wills said, and she could hear something in his voice that might have been dry humor or might have been something else. He's asking for you. She looked at the supply shelves in front of her. Gauze, IV tubing, saline bags, the ordinary materials of a system designed to maintain human life. I'm on modified duty. I'm not assigned to his case. He's not asking as your patient. He's asking as someone who has a specific thing he wants to say to the person who kept him alive. A pause. I'll be there when you come. It won't take long. She thought about Voss's office, about the review, about the 48 hours of modified duty that was almost certainly the opening move in something longer and more deliberate. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. The SICU was 2 floors up, and it took her 15 of the 20 minutes to arrange a clean handoff on the floor cases she was managing. She took the stairs, not the elevator, because the stairs were faster, and she didn't want to be seen waiting. Strickland was in a private bay at the end of the unit, which was either standard for high-profile patients or had been arranged specifically for security reasons, probably both. There were 2 Marines in civilian clothes outside the bay door. They checked her ID without being asked, which she respected. Inside, Wills was standing near the window again, which seemed to be his default position. Strickland was in the bed, elevated 30 degrees, with the wiring and tubing of post-surgical care arranged around him. He was awake. His color was poor and his eyes were heavy from the sedation they'd been walking back, but his gaze when it found her was direct and fully present. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had trained themselves to be cognitively available even when their body was behind on the agreement. Sit down, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation period. She sat. He looked at her for a long moment. Garrett told me what you did last night. I did my job, she said. He also told me about the fob photograph, about the soldier. He paused to breathe, but carefully. The way people breathed after thoracic procedures. His name was Corporal David Solis. He's been in and out of this hospital, actually. Different unit, different context. But he's alive. Another careful breath. Because of what you did that day. She looked at the man in the bed. She thought about Kandahar in August. She thought about the specific texture of that afternoon. The light, the heat, the way the sound had been wrong a half second before everything went wrong. She thought about working on a man she'd never met, in conditions that were not good enough for what she was trying to do, using what she had, which was not enough, but was enough because she made it enough. She had not thought about that afternoon in a long time. She had gotten very good at not thinking about specific things. I didn't know his name, she said. You weren't supposed to. The situation didn't allow for introductions. Something in his expression shifted. That's one of the things about this work. The people you save become abstractions. You never get to know if the abstraction turned into anything real. She looked at him. How is he? Married, 2 kids, working in logistics now, keeps his head down. A pause. He asked me once if I knew who the medic was. The one who kept him alive. I told him I was working on it. A dry, careful exhale that might have been the beginning of a laugh before he stopped it from becoming one. Took longer than expected. She sat with that for a moment. Sir, she said, I appreciate you telling me this, but I need to be honest with you. There is a situation developing in this hospital that is complicated, and I'm not sure this conversation at this moment is going to help it. Wills turned from the window. Tell us. She told them about the modified duty, about the review, about the pattern of the previous 14 months in enough detail that the shape of it was clear, not just the most recent incident. She kept it factual. She did not perform outrage or ask for sympathy because she was not in the habit of either. When she finished, Strickland was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Wills. What's Voss's standing in this institution? Department Chief, 18 years on staff, strong external reputation. Wills paused. The kind of record that makes HR careful. And the review he's initiated? I've been making some calls this morning. Wills's voice was neutral in a way that suggested the calls had not all been pleasant. It's not a standard post-incident review. The documentation is moving faster than normal protocol requires. He filed the modification order before the end of his shift last night. Nora looked at him. That timing is unusual. Very. Wills held her gaze. He filed it at 12:40 a.m. Your shift officially ended at midnight. She processed that. The timeline meant Voss had initiated the action while she was still in the consultation room with Wills, before she'd even left the building, which meant he hadn't waited to review anything. He had moved to constrain her before he knew what the meeting had been about, which meant someone had told him about the meeting quickly, which meant someone on that floor was reporting to Voss in real time. She thought about who had been at the nursing station when she'd gone to the consultation room. She thought about shift patterns and loyalties and the invisible information channels that ran through every institutional hierarchy she had ever worked inside. I have documentation, she said. 14 months of it. Every flagged assessment, every rejected recommendation, every incident where the correct diagnosis was mine and the credit went elsewhere. Strickland's eyes were very steady on her face. You kept records. I was a combat medic. I kept records of everything. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't fully read. What do you want to happen, Nurse Callahan? The question sat in the room. She had not asked herself that question directly. She had been managing the situation, tracking the variables, keeping her head down and her documentation clean. She had not stopped to consider what she actually wanted the outcome to be. She thought about it now. I want to keep doing my job, she said. I don't want a ceremony. I don't want Voss publicly destroyed, although if the review process finds what it finds, that's not my responsibility to prevent. I want to work this floor without being told that knowing something makes me a liability. She paused. And I want the record corrected. Not for me. For the next person who comes through this system with the right answer and no standing to give it. Strickland looked at her for a long moment. That's a reasonable thing to want, he said. That afternoon she found out through Deb Forsyth, who was loyal to the floor in the way of people who had outlasted everyone else and owed allegiance to nothing smaller than the institution itself. The two people had come to the administrative offices at Crestview Medical Center with federal identification and spent an hour in a meeting with the chief medical officer and the hospital's legal team. Deb did not know what was discussed. She knew the CMO had canceled 2 subsequent meetings and that the legal team had requested the Strickland case file and 3 others going back 18 months. Nora processed this information without reacting visibly. She finished her shift. She documented everything. She drove home through weather that had gone from ice to cold rain to something between the two that the windshield wipers handled badly. On the table in her apartment, when she got home, she unfolded the photograph that Wills had left behind in the consultation room. She looked at it for a long time. The forward operating base, the harsh light, the 2 figures, one injured, one working. She had not remembered that anyone had a camera out that day. She had not thought about that day as a moment. She had thought about it as a procedure. As a problem she solved with the tools she had available. Looking at it now, she could see it was also a moment. She set the photograph on the windowsill where she could see it from across the room and went to make dinner, which was pasta from a box because she was tired and the refrigerator was underpopulated, and some nights that was just what it was. She was eating at the counter when her phone rang. The number was Crestview's main administrative line. She stared at it for 2 rings, picked up. Nurse Callahan. The voice was the CMO's administrative assistant, a woman named Patricia, who Nora had interacted with exactly twice in 14 months, and who now sounded like someone reading from a script that made her uncomfortable. Dr. Holloway would like to see you in his office tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. I'll be there, Nora said. He also wanted to convey that you should be aware this meeting involves a review of your employment status. The pasta was getting cold. I understand, she said. She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone on the counter and the food going cold and the photograph on the windowsill. She was not afraid. She had been in situations where fear was the appropriate response, and she knew what it felt like, and this was not it. This was something else. The tight, focused clarity of a situation that had narrowed to a specific point, where the variables had reduced and the path forward was either there or it wasn't. She picked up the phone again and called Wills. He answered on the second ring. They move faster than expected, she said. I know. His voice was flat in a way that told her he had been expecting this call. Holloway's office contacted the legal team at 4:30 this afternoon. The modified duty is being elevated. To what? A beat. Suspension pending review. They'll tell you tomorrow. She let out a slow breath. That's not a review process. That's a termination pipeline. Yes. And Voss is driving it. Voss filed the paperwork, but the speed suggests he has support higher than his own department. Wills paused. There are people in Crestview's administrative structure who have worked with Voss for a long time. Loyalty in institutions like this tends to protect the person who's been there longest. She looked at the window. You said you've been making calls. I have. Are those calls the kind that change things, or the kind that create a record for later? Another beat, longer this time. Both, he said. The ones that change things take longer. A pause that felt like something being decided. But there's something I should tell you. Strickland made a call this afternoon, not through official channels, directly to someone he's known for 20 years who sits on the board of a hospital oversight organization that has regulatory authority over Crestview. She processed that. That's a significant escalation. Aaron Strickland woke up from surgery and spent the first 4 hours of his consciousness gathering information about why the person who kept him alive was being quietly removed from her position. His voice was still flat, but there was something underneath it. He's not a man who sits with that information and does nothing. She put her free hand flat on the counter. The surface was cool and solid. She focused on that for a moment. The review tomorrow, she said. Do I bring documentation? Bring everything, Wills said. And Nora, he used her first name, which was the first time. You're not walking in there alone. She didn't ask what that meant. She already understood that the shape of tomorrow had changed and that the room she was going to walk into at 7 a.m. was not the room they thought they were preparing for her. She went to bed at 10. She lay in the dark and thought about the long, specific discipline of being the person in the room that nobody was watching because they didn't think she was worth watching. She thought about how that discipline had felt at various points, like weakness and like patience and like something she had not yet had the right word for. She was beginning to think the word might be strategy. She slept well, better than she had in weeks. At 6:45 a.m., she was on her way out the door with a folder of 14 months of documentation under her arm when her phone rang. The number was the SICU nursing station. She answered. Nurse Callahan. A voice she didn't immediately recognize, young, male, slightly unsteady. This is Resident Torres. I'm sorry to call you directly. I need to tell you something before you come in today. She stopped walking. What is it? I filed a formal statement last night. She could hear him breathing. About the Osei case. And the Marcus Webb case. I documented what I observed, what the clinical record doesn't show. A pause. And I wasn't the only one. Nurse Forsyth filed separately, and Ruiz, the transport paramedic, he went to the oversight board directly. She stood on the wet steps outside her building. The rain had stopped overnight and the sky was a flat, pale gray, the kind that came before the weather decided what it was going to do next. Torres, she said, why are you telling me this? His voice steadied slightly. Because I documented what Voss told me to document in the Osei case, and I didn't put your name in the record, and I have been thinking about it for 2 months, and I'm not... He stopped. I'm not able to keep doing that. She was quiet for a moment. Is there anything you need from me before my meeting? She asked. No. A pause. I just wanted you to know you weren't going in there with nothing. She looked at the gray sky. I know, she said. Thank you. She ended the call and walked to her car. She thought about what Torres had just told her, about Deb Forsyth, who had been at Crestview for 19 years, and clearly decided that longevity did not require complicity. About Ruiz, who had watched her work in a trauma bay and afterwards said it wasn't finished. She had spent 14 months keeping her documentation quietly and assuming it would never matter, or that if it mattered, it would matter only to her, in some future exit interview or legal proceeding that would resolve nothing in real time. She had not expected the records other people were keeping. She drove to Crestview in the flat gray morning, parked in the structure, rode the elevator to the administrative floor. The hallway outside Holloway's office was quiet at this hour. None of the usual traffic, no carts, no patients, just the specific silence of a floor that had not yet started its day. She was 3 steps from the office door when she heard it. Not voices inside. Voices down the hall, coming from the secondary conference room, the one used for larger departmental meetings, which should have been empty at 6:50 a.m. She recognized Voss's voice, the contained version, the managing a situation version. She recognized the CMO's voice, shorter syllables, lower pitch. And then a third voice, which she did not recognize until she'd heard 4 words of it, and then recognized completely, because it was the kind of voice that carried whether it wanted to or not. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years giving orders in environments where being heard was a survival matter. Strickland. Aaron Strickland was in the secondary conference room at 6:50 a.m., not yet 40 hours out of thoracic surgery, in a conversation that was clearly not a social visit. She stood in the hallway. She thought about walking past, about going directly to Holloway's office, sitting down, laying her folder on the table, and letting the morning proceed on its scheduled terms. She stood very still instead. She heard Voss say something that included the phrase departmental standards and scope of practice. She heard Strickland's voice cut across it, not loudly, but with the particular economy of someone who had very little patience for what they were hearing. She caught 4 words clearly through the conference room door. 4 words, said in the flat, absolute tone of a man who was not making a threat because he did not need to make threats. 4 words that told her everything about where the next hour was going and what the outcome was already becoming before she'd even walked into the room. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her folder, and she walked toward the door. The 4 words were, "That is not acceptable." She heard them clearly through the conference room door, in Strickland's voice, with the particular flatness that was not anger, but was worse than anger, because it contained no temperature at all. Just the cold, load-bearing weight of a senior officer who had made a final assessment and was communicating it. She kept walking. Not into the conference room. Past it, to the end of the hall, where a window looked out over the parking structure and the flat gray sky was beginning to separate into something lighter at the eastern edge. She stood there for a moment and thought about what she was walking into and what she needed to be when she walked into it. She had been in high-stakes rooms before. Different tables, different uniforms, different vocabulary, but the structure was always the same. Someone with institutional authority trying to define the terms of a situation in a way that protected their position, and someone else either accepting those terms or refusing them and bearing the consequences. She had learned early in her service that the outcome of those rooms was rarely determined by the person with the most power. It was determined by the person who was most prepared to let the truth be inconvenient. She turned away from the window. She went back down the hall. She did not knock on the conference room door. She knocked on Holloway's office door instead, at 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes before her scheduled meeting, and heard the CMO's assistant say, "Come in," and went in. The office was empty except for Patricia, who looked like she had been managing the morning's disruptions since 6 a.m. and was operating on administrative adrenaline. She looked at Nora with an expression that was professionally blank, but had something underneath it. Not sympathy exactly, more like the careful neutrality of someone who has seen which way the wind is moving and is not going to say so out loud. "Dr. Holloway has been delayed," Patricia said. "He asks that you wait." "Of course," Nora said. She sat. She placed the folder on her knee and did not open it. She waited for 11 minutes, which was long enough to hear the conference room down the hall go quiet and then hear footsteps in the corridor, more than 2 sets. Then Holloway's office door opened and the CMO came in, and he was not alone. Behind him was Voss, which she had expected. Behind Voss was a man she had never seen before, mid-60s, suit without a tie, carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive and well-used, the kind of person whose presence in a hospital administrative office suggested legal counsel or board representation or both. And behind him was Lieutenant General Wills. Wills caught her eye when he came through the door and gave her nothing. No nod, no signal, no indication of what the last 11 minutes in the conference room had produced. He simply moved to the side of the room and stood with his hands behind his back, which she had come to understand was his version of taking up as little institutional space as possible while remaining completely present. Holloway sat behind his desk. He was 58, thin, with the specific look of a man who had spent 20 years managing competing institutional pressures and had developed a kind of permanent vigilance as a result. I was not unkind. He was also not the kind of person who would sacrifice professional safety for principle unless the calculation clearly favored it. "Nurse Callahan," he said, "thank you for coming in." "Of course," she said. The man with the portfolio sat in the chair to Holloway's right. Voss remained standing near the door, which was either a power move or an indication that he did not plan to stay long. "I want to begin," Holloway said, "by acknowledging that the last 18 hours have involved several developments that were not anticipated." He paused. "I've had conversations this morning that have significantly expanded the scope of what began as a departmental review." Nora looked at him. She did not fill the silence. "Dr. Voss initiated a modified duty order following the Strickland case," Holloway continued. "That order is currently it's being reviewed in the context of other information that has come to our attention." Voss said, from near the door, "I'd like to note that the modified duty order was issued in accordance with standard departmental protocol following an incident in which nursing staff exceeded—" "Leonard." Holloway's voice was quiet. That was all. Voss stopped. She had never heard Holloway use Voss's first name in a professional context. She did not think Voss had either, based on the way his jaw moved slightly after it. "We are going to have a different conversation than the one this meeting was originally scheduled for," Holloway said. He looked at Nora. "Nurse Callahan, I've been given the opportunity to review documentation this morning. Documentation that pertains to several cases over the past 14 months in which clinical observations made by you were not attributed correctly in the medical record." He opened a folder on his desk. "I want to ask you directly whether you have records of these incidents from your own documentation." She set her folder on his desk. He opened it. He spent 40 seconds looking at the first 3 pages, and his expression did not change, which told her the expression was being carefully managed. "This is comprehensive," he said. "I kept records," she said. "It was habit. There are 43 incidents documented here." 47, she said. "The last 4 are in the back." Voss made a sound near the door that was not quite a word. Holloway looked at him briefly, then looked back at Nora. "I need to ask whether you intend to pursue this documentation through external channels." It was the right question. It was the only question that mattered to him right now, because the answer determined what the next several weeks looked like for the institution. She understood that, and she was not going to hold it against him. Institutional leaders asked institutional questions. That was their job. "That depends," she said, "on what happens in this room." The man with the portfolio, who had not spoken until now, said, "That's a reasonable position." Holloway nodded slowly. He looked at Voss one more time, a longer look this time, with something in it that she could not fully read but that felt like the end of something. "Leonard," he said, "I think it would be appropriate for you to recuse yourself from any further involvement in this review." The room was very quiet. Voss looked at Holloway. He looked at the man with the portfolio. He looked at Wills, who looked back at him with the absolute stillness of someone who had already made all his decisions and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. He did not look at Nora. He left. The door closed. She let out a breath that she had not known she was holding. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes, and by the end of it, the modified duty order had been suspended pending a formal review that Holloway was now characterizing as an institutional audit rather than an individual performance review. The man with the portfolio, who turned out to be representing a hospital oversight board, as Wills had indicated the previous night, oversight board, as Wills had indicated the previous night, spent most of the meeting asking careful, specific questions about documentation procedures and clinical attribution protocols that were not about Nora at all, and were entirely about the structural conditions that had allowed a 47-incident record to accumulate unaddressed. She answered every question she was asked and did not volunteer anything extra. When she walked out of the office at 8:15 a.m., the hallway felt exactly the same as it had at 6:58. Same carpet, same fluorescent light, same distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Institutions didn't change their physical character when something significant happened inside them. They just kept running. Wills fell into step beside her. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "That's probably not entirely true." She considered it. "I'm functional," she said, which was more accurate. "Go home," he said. "You're not on the schedule today. The modified duty was suspended, not reinstated, which means your status is currently undefined," she said, "temporarily." He paused. "The audit is real. It will take time, but it's moving in the right direction." She stopped walking. They were at the elevator bank, and the elevator was open and empty, which almost never happened. She held the door. "Strickland," she said, how is he this morning?" "Complaining about the food and asking to be given his briefing files." A pause. "He's fine." She stepped into the elevator. She went home. The next 4 days were the strangest of her time at Crestview, which was not a low bar. She was technically employed, technically not on modified duty, technically awaiting the conclusion of an audit that was generating paperwork at a rate that seemed to involve every clinical record the hospital had produced in the last 2 years. She was not scheduled. She was not suspended. She existed in a category that the human resources system apparently had no good word for. She used the time to sleep, to run in the mornings along the waterfront, where the weather was cold and wet in the way that Portland winters sustained for months, the kind of conditions that felt miserable in the abstract and clarifying in practice, if you kept moving. She called her mother in Boise twice, which was more than her usual frequency, and did not explain the situation because explaining it would have required a level of backstory that the phone calls didn't have room for. On the second day, Torres texted her, just 2 words. "They're looking." On the third day, Deb Forsyth called and told her, with the calm specificity of someone reporting field intelligence, that 3 additional nurses had added statements to the audit file and that the hospital's Department of Risk Management had requested an independent review of clinical attribution practices going back 30 months. On the 4th day, Strickland's team called and asked if she would be willing to come to the SICU. She went. He was sitting up in bed, which was a significant improvement over 4 days prior. The wiring had been reduced, the tubes were fewer, and his color had come back enough that he looked less like a patient and more like a man who was impatiently occupying a bed in a hospital instead of doing his actual job. He had a tablet on the tray table and a stack of briefing documents that someone had clearly brought in violation of the unit's standard policy, which the nursing staff appeared to have decided to overlook. "Callahan," he said when she came in. "General." She sat without being asked, because standing for a conversation with someone in a hospital bed created a dynamic that served neither of them. "You look better." "I look terrible," he said, "but my lungs work," which is the relevant metric. He set the tablet aside. "I want to talk to you about something that isn't the audit." She waited. "The SOCOM Medical Support Program," he said. "The expansion I pushed through in 2019. Do you know what's been happening to it since?" She did, broadly. She had followed the policy developments through the veteran community networks she stayed loosely connected to. The expansion had faced ongoing institutional resistance from military medical establishment, budget pressures, a change in command priorities. It was surviving, but narrowly. "I have a general picture," she said. "The picture is that it's surviving on reputation and declining on resources," he said. "And part of what it needs, part of what would shore up the argument for its value at a policy level, is a clear demonstration of what these trained combat medics do when they enter civilian medicine." He looked at her steadily. "What they bring that the system isn't measuring because the system doesn't have a way to measure it yet." She looked at him. "You want to use the audit. Not use it, contextualize it." He shifted slightly against the pillow. What's happening in this hospital right now is happening in every major medical institution that has absorbed veterans from the post-2001 era. The people who were trained in austere environments under extreme conditions are going into civilian medicine and getting constrained by credentialing systems that don't account for what they actually know. The Osei case, the Webb case. Your cases, they're not outliers. They're the pattern. She sat with that. What are you asking me to do? She said. Nothing right now, he said. I'm asking you to be aware that this situation has a larger dimension than what happens to Leonard Voss's employment. He paused. And I'm asking whether, when the audit is done and your status is clarified, you'd be willing to have a further conversation about that dimension. She looked at the man in the bed. She thought about the Senate testimony she had read twice, about the policy language she had memorized in those months after separation, when she was trying to understand what the civilian system was going to ask of her and whether she would be able to give it. Yes, she said. I'm willing to have that conversation. She left the SICU at 11:30 a.m. and was at the elevator when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Nurse Callahan. Female voice, clipped, professional. This is Dr. Sandra Marsh. I'm the attending. We worked the Strickland intake together. I remember, Nora said. I've submitted a statement to the audit. A pause. I should have done it the night it happened. I want you to know I observed what I observed, and I documented it accurately, and I'm sorry it took this long. Nora leaned against the wall next to the elevator. Thank you, she said. I also want to tell you something else. Marsh's voice shifted slightly. I had a conversation with Holloway this morning, off the record. He told me that the audit findings are significant. More significant than he anticipated when he initiated it. A beat. He used the word systemic. The elevator arrived and opened, and she didn't get in. Okay, she said. I don't know what happens next, Marsh said, but I wanted you to hear it from someone who was in that room. What you did that night was not nothing, and the record is going to reflect that. She rode the elevator down in silence. She was almost to the lobby when the alert came through on her phone. Not a call, not a text, but the hospital's mass notification system, which pushed to all registered staff regardless of current duty status. She read it while she was walking. Major multi-vehicle accident, I-84 eastbound, mass casualty event. All available trauma staff report immediately. She stopped in the middle of the lobby. Around her, she could already see the machinery of a hospital shifting. Staff who had been moving at their ordinary pace suddenly moving differently. The specific change in gait and focus that preceded an influx. The charge nurse at the admissions desk reaching for the radio. The security personnel repositioning. The lobby's ambient sound changed, higher pitched, faster. She read the notification again. All available trauma staff. She was not on the schedule. Her status was undefined. She was technically neither on modified duty nor cleared for active assignment, which meant her position in the next 60 minutes was an institutional question that nobody had answered. She thought about that for approximately 3 seconds. Then she walked to the nurse's locker room, changed into scrubs, and went to the trauma floor. The charge nurse on duty was a man named Terrell Washington, who had worked the trauma floor for 11 years and whose primary professional attribute was the ability to make fast decisions without visible stress. When Nora appeared at the trauma station, he looked at her for exactly 1 second. Bay 4 and 5 are setting up, he said. Bay 3 needs an experienced nurse for airway management on intake. You good? Yes, she said. Go. She went. The first wave arrived at 12:47 p.m., 4 ambulances in 9 minutes, the patients ranging from moderate to critical. The kind of intake that required every person on the floor to be exactly where they needed to be and doing exactly what they needed to do without waiting for someone to tell them. Nora was in Bay 3 before the first gurney cleared the doors, running the airway setup with a second-year resident named Kwame Asante, who was technically competent and clearly running on the adrenaline reserve of someone who had not yet worked a mass casualty intake. Talk me through what you're seeing, she told him as the patient came in. Male, late 30s, multiple blunt trauma, GCS of 9. Out loud. Airway compromised, Asante said. Suspected C-spine. He needs intubation. Position of choice? Inline stabilization, RSI. He was pulling the drugs. etomidate, and SUC. Weights? He looked at the patient, made a quick estimate, called the doses. Good, she said. I'll hold C-spine. You're on the tube. Call your landmarks. The intubation went in on the first attempt, which was not guaranteed and which she was prepared to assist on if it hadn't been, but Asante was steadier with the scope in his hand than he looked, and the tube was confirmed and secured in under 90 seconds. The second patient in Bay 3 came in 7 minutes later. A woman, mid-50s, restrained driver, chest trauma, pressure dropping. Nora ran her assessment and called the attending, who was Dr. Marsh, and Marsh came in and they worked the case together in a way that felt different from most of Nora's interactions on this floor. Direct, efficient, each of them doing what they were positioned to do without the ambient friction of hierarchy getting in the way. Marsh confirmed Nora's read on the hemothorax, ordered the tube thoracostomy, and then looked at Nora as the resident prepped. "You holding up?" Marsh asked. "Yes," Nora said. "Good." Marsh went back to the procedure. "Keep talking to me." She kept talking. The mass casualty influx ran for 4 hours. By 3 p.m., 12 patients had come through the trauma floor, 2 had gone directly to the OR, 1 had been pronounced, and the rest were distributed across the SICU and the medical floor in various states of stabilization. The trauma team was running on empty by the end of it. Not dramatically, not visibly to the patients, but in the specific way that experienced emergency personnel ran on empty, which was quietly and with full function and with the understanding that the decompression would have to wait. Nora was at the documentation station at 3:20 p.m. when Terrell Washington appeared at her elbow. "Good work today," he said. "Thanks," she said. "HR called." He kept his voice neutral. "Asking about your status. I told them you were in active trauma intake and that I had invoked the mass casualty all available staff protocol and that the paperwork would follow." A pause. "Which it will, from me, right now, in about 15 minutes. She looked at him. "Will that cover it?" "It'll create a record." He shrugged. "Records are how things get decided around here. You know that better than most." She did. She finished her documentation. She was washing her hands in the staff bathroom off the nurse's station when she heard voices in the hall outside. 2 of them. One she recognized immediately as Voss, and one she did not. She turned off the water. She did not move. Through the door, she could hear fragments. Not complete sentences, but enough. Voss's voice, low and controlled, saying something about the audit and about the scope and about... She caught the phrase prejudicial to the department. The other voice, lower still, saying something she couldn't make out. And then Voss, clearer. "The problem is that she's been made into something she isn't. The military association, the Strickland connection, it's creating a narrative that doesn't reflect the actual clinical record." A pause. The other voice again. Just the tail end of it. The board's position, Voss said, is based on incomplete information. When the full picture is available, Leonard, the other voice, and now she recognized it, the man with the portfolio from Holloway's office. "The full picture is why we're having this conversation." Silence. She put her hand on the bathroom door. She did not open it yet. She heard the portfolio man say, clearly and without inflection, "The independent review is going to report findings on Thursday. I would strongly recommend that you have legal representation in place before that meeting." A longer silence. Then footsteps, moving away. Then nothing. She opened the door. The hall was empty. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Thursday was 2 days away. She walked back to the documentation station, sat down, and pulled up the case files from the afternoon's intake. She worked through them systematically, completing each field with the specificity that mattered when records became the basis of decisions, noting every clinical observation, every procedure, every outcome with the precision she had been trained to maintain, even when everything around her was moving too fast. She was on the 4th case file when Torres appeared. He looked like he hadn't slept well. He sat in the chair beside her and said nothing for a moment. "I heard about the afternoon," he said finally. "You were in Bay 3 during the whole intake." "Yes." Terrell invoked the mass casualty protocol. "Yes." Torres nodded slowly. He had the look of someone doing calculations. "Voss is going to argue that you acted outside your status." "I know." "The protocol is clear. It covers all available clinical staff during declared mass casualty events. Your status during the intake was undefined, she said, which means the protocol applies. He was quiet for a moment. The audit findings come Thursday. I know. There are things in those findings that are... I've seen the preliminary scope. He looked at his hands. It's not just the attribution issues. Risk management found 3 cases in the last 2 years where documentation was altered after the fact. Clinical records with edits that don't have the required audit trail. She turned to look at him. Altered by who? She said. He met her eyes. She understood the answer before he gave it. The edits were made from 2 terminals, Torres said quietly. One is the attending physician workstation in the trauma suite. The other is the departmental chief's office. She looked at the documentation screen in front of her. She thought about the Marcus Webb case, about the Becca Ose case, about 47 incidents in a folder that she had kept because she was trained to keep records, and she had not fully understood, until this moment, that the records had been necessary because someone else was unmaking them. Her hands were very still on the keyboard. Torres, she said. What was changed? Timestamps, he said. Assessment times. In the Webb case, the record shows the hemothorax was flagged by the attending physician 40 minutes before it actually was. In the Ose case, the clinical note documenting your foreign body assessment doesn't exist. It was deleted. A pause. There may be others they haven't found yet. She thought about Becca Ose, 14 years old, struggling to breathe, a washer lodged in her right bronchus. She thought about the 40 minutes that would have been lost if Torres had not ordered the fluoroscopy. She thought about what the altered timestamp in the Webb case meant for the institution's liability record, for insurance review, for every downstream consequence that flowed from a patient nearly dying, and the documentation suggesting it was handled correctly and on time. She thought about what kind of person systematically altered clinical records over a period of 2 years. She thought about what kind of institution allowed it. Thursday, she said. Thursday, Torres said. She nodded once. She went back to her documentation. At 5 p.m., she was done. She logged out of the system, gathered her things, and was at the elevator when Deb Forsyth appeared, moving with the specific purposeful speed of someone carrying information they did not want to carry via phone. Nora. Deb almost never used her first name. There's something you need to see. What is it? The audit team pulled Strickland's intake file for cross-reference. Deb's voice was low. They found something in the pre-arrival documentation, the transport record. She looked at Nora steadily. There was a second notification sent to this hospital before the medevac landed. Not a standard paramedic handoff. A direct communication from Marine Forces Command, addressed to the department chief. Nora looked at her. What was in it? A patient identity notification, Deb said. Name, rank, status. The communication was received at 9:26 p.m. 9:26. The medevac had landed at 9:38. Voss was notified of Strickland's identity 12 minutes before the patient arrived, Nora said. Yes, she processed that. He knew who was coming. He knew who was coming, Deb confirmed. And then he spent 20 minutes working the case without identifying the tension pneumothorax that you flagged on intake. The elevator arrived. Neither of them moved. Nora looked at the open elevator doors. She thought about a man on a table, his blood pressure disappearing, a room full of trained physicians who had not seen what she had seen. She thought about whether that failure was incompetence or something else. She thought about what it meant that the department chief had known, 12 minutes in advance, that the patient arriving was a senior military officer whose survival would attract significant scrutiny and had still managed the case in a way that nearly ended in that patient's death. She thought about altered records. She thought about the specific arithmetic of someone protecting themselves from the consequences of their own failures by making the failures invisible. Does the audit team have this? She said. They have the communication log, Deb said. Whether they've drawn the connection yet, I don't know. Nora stepped into the elevator. They will by Thursday, she said. The doors closed. She rode down alone, with the quiet machinery of the building around her, and the weight of what she now understood settling into something that was not outrage and not satisfaction, but something more complicated. The feeling of a picture finally resolving into full clarity, all the components she had been accumulating for 14 months, clicking into the arrangement they had always been moving toward, so that the thing she was looking at was no longer a series of separate incidents, but a single, sustained pattern with a beginning and a shape, and as of Thursday, an end. She walked through the lobby. She pushed through the front doors. The rain had started again, soft and steady, the kind that didn't announce itself. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She stood under the awning and answered. Nurse Callahan. A voice she did not know. Male, older, very precise in his diction. My name is Marcus Holt. I'm the chair of the Pacific Northwest Regional Hospital Oversight Board. A pause, just long enough to be deliberate. I understand you've been doing your job under circumstances that would have stopped most people. She watched the rain. I've been managing, she said. I need to tell you something before Thursday, he said. Something that isn't in the audit report yet, because it came to us this afternoon. Another deliberate pause. We've received a formal complaint from an insurance adjuster working on 3 of the cases in your documentation file. She's been investigating a billing anomaly in the Webb case. She noticed the timestamp discrepancy in the clinical record didn't align with the ambulance log. She pulled the thread. A breath. What she found goes beyond what the audit is currently scoped for. Nora went very still. How far beyond? She said. The billing irregularities, Holt said, are connected to 4 additional cases not in your file. Cases where the altered documentation supported insurance claims for procedures that were billed as more complex and more remunerative than what the clinical record, accurately reconstructed, would support. She understood immediately. This isn't just about attribution, she said. No, Holt said. It isn't. She looked at the rain falling on the parking structure. She thought about 14 months of keeping records she thought were for her own protection. She thought about 47 incidents in a folder on Holloway's desk. She thought about Becca Osei breathing normally because someone pulled a metal washer from her airway in time. She thought about what it meant that the thing she had been living inside for 14 months was not only professional contempt and institutional hierarchy, it was something with financial architecture underneath it, something that had been built deliberately and maintained carefully by a person who had spent 18 years constructing a professional identity that could not afford to be questioned. Nurse Callahan, Holt said, are you still there? Yes, she said. Thursday's meeting has been moved up, he said. It is now tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., Crestview Medical Center, board conference room on the 12th floor. A pause. I would like you to be present. The rain came down. I'll be there, she said. She ended the call. She stood under the awning for another moment. Somewhere behind her, through the lobby glass, she could see the trauma floor running, the ordinary machinery of a place where people came when they had run out of other options, doing its work regardless of what happened in board conference rooms or audit findings, or the calculations of people who had confused the institution they were supposed to serve with the image they were trying to protect. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about what came next. She put her phone in her pocket, stepped out from under the awning, and walked into the rain. She walked to her car in the rain and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for 4 minutes. The billing irregularities. 4 additional cases. Procedures billed at complexity levels the accurate clinical record wouldn't support. She ran the arithmetic. 18 years at Crestview. A trauma program built on a reputation that generated referrals and contracts and insurance relationships and research funding. A department chief whose authority over the clinical record was, until 72 hours ago, essentially unchecked. And underneath all of it, a system of small adjustments, timestamps moved, assessments reattributed, nursing observations deleted, that served 2 purposes simultaneously. The first was professional, eliminating the evidence that someone else had seen the diagnosis first. The second was financial, creating a record that supported billing at higher complexity tiers. She had spent 14 months believing the problem was ego. It was also money. She started the car. She drove home in the rain, made tea she didn't drink, and spent the evening going through her documentation folder page by page, annotating every incident with the billing codes she could reconstruct from memory and from the case details she had noted at the time. She was not a billing specialist. She was not going to be the one who drew the financial conclusions. But she could cross-reference the dates, the cases, the documentation gaps, and she could present it in a sequence that made the pattern visible to people who were. She worked until 11:30 p.m. She set the alarm for 5:45. She slept 6 hours, which was more than she'd expected. The 12th floor of Crestview Medical Center was not a place most clinical staff visited. It housed the administrative and executive offices, The board conference room, legal and compliance, and a row of corner offices with views over the city that were occupied by people whose job descriptions involved managing the institution from a sufficient distance that its daily reality didn't interfere with their strategic vision. Nora had been on the 12th floor twice in 14 months, once for her onboarding paperwork, once for a mandatory all-staff safety training that had been held in the conference room because the usual venue was under renovation. She arrived at 7:48 a.m. The conference room was already occupied. Through the glass panel beside the door, she could see 8 people around the table. Holloway, the man with the portfolio, whose name she now knew was Raymond Solis and who represented the Oversight Board. Marcus Holt, who had called her the previous evening. 2 people she didn't recognize who had the look of outside legal counsel. A woman with a tablet and a recording device who was clearly there in a documentation capacity, and Wills. No Voss. She noted the absence and filed it. A woman she hadn't seen before, early 50s, short gray hair, a suit that was expensive without being showy, opened the conference room door before Nora could knock. "Nurse Callahan." Not a question. "I'm Ellen Pruitt. I'm representing your professional interest this morning." Nora looked at her. "I didn't retain anyone." "No," Pruitt said. "You didn't need to. Lieutenant General Wills arranged for the representation yesterday afternoon through the Veterans Legal Advocacy Network. It's pro bono, in case that's a concern." She stepped back to let Nora in. "Sit next to me. Let me do the initial talking, and I'll signal you when they need to hear from you directly." Nora came in. Wills caught her eye across the table and gave her the same thing he always gave her. Nothing visible, just presence. She sat. The meeting began at 8 a.m. with Holt laying out the scope of what the Oversight Board had found, which took 22 minutes and was delivered in the flat, affectless language of someone who had been in institutional oversight long enough to have learned that the most devastating information lands hardest when it's delivered without drama. The summary was this. Over a period of approximately 26 months, clinical records in Crestview's trauma department had been systematically altered in ways that served 2 distinct purposes. The first was the suppression and reattribution of clinical assessments made by nursing staff. Specifically, but not exclusively, staff who had raised concerns about departmental practices or who had demonstrated clinical capabilities that created friction with the attending hierarchy. The second was the upward adjustment of procedure complexity in billing documentation, in cases where the altered clinical record supported a higher reimbursement tier from insurance carriers. The financial exposure, Holt said, was not yet fully quantified. The preliminary figure was significant. He used the word significant 3 times in the 22 minutes. Each time, the room got slightly quieter. When he finished, Raymond Solis asked Nora directly to walk through her documentation. She did, not all 47 incidents, but 14 of them in detail, chosen because they represented the clearest pattern and because they had the most corroboration from the statements Torres, Forsyth, Marsh, and Ruiz had filed independently. She spoke for 31 minutes. She did not perform outrage. She did not characterize. She described events, dates, and outcomes and let the sequence do the work. When she finished, one of the outside legal counselors, a man in his early 60s who had said nothing until now, looked at his notes and said, "The mass casualty intake 2 days ago. You responded under the mass casualty protocol while on undefined duty status." "Yes," she said. "Dr. Voss has filed a grievance regarding that response, citing unauthorized clinical activity during a period of modified duty status." Pruitt said, beside her, "The modified duty order was suspended pending this audit. Nurse Callahan's status at the time of the mass casualty intake was undefined, as she noted. The all-available staff protocol invoked by the charge nurse, documented in the mass casualty log, covered her participation. The grievance has no procedural basis." The legal counselor made a note. "Furthermore," Pruitt continued, "given the findings presented this morning regarding the circumstances under which the modified duty order was initiated, the appropriate question is not whether Nurse Callahan's participation in the mass casualty response was authorized. The appropriate question is whether the original modified duty order was itself initiated in good faith, or whether it was initiated as a retaliatory measure to suppress a witness to the events of the Strickland intake." The room was very quiet. Holloway was looking at the table. "Where's Dr. Voss?" Nora asked. Holloway looked up. Holt answered. Dr. Voss was notified of this meeting yesterday afternoon. He arrived at the hospital at 7:15 this morning, accompanied by personal legal counsel. At 7:40, his counsel requested a recess before the meeting began. The recess was granted. At 7:52, Dr. Voss's counsel informed us that Dr. Voss was invoking his right to review the complete audit findings before making any formal response. Which is his right, Solis said, and which does not change the board's current position. What is the board's current position? Nora asked. Holt looked at her directly. That your employment record should reflect no adverse action of any kind arising from the incidents documented in this audit. That the modified duty order and the associated grievance be expunged. And that a formal review of the trauma department's leadership structure be initiated immediately, with interim leadership appointed pending outcome. She looked at him. And Voss? That, Holt said, is a matter for legal process. The board's findings have been referred to the Oregon Medical Board and to the relevant federal authorities regarding the billing irregularities. He paused. The process will take time, but it has begun. Nora nodded once. She looked at Wills. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not satisfaction exactly, but something close to it, the way someone looked when a long calculation finally resolved. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, covering procedural questions about the audit timeline, interim staffing in the trauma department, and the formal documentation of the board's findings. Nora answered questions when she was asked and deferred to Pruitt when the questions were legal in nature. She drank half a cup of coffee that someone put in front of her and was cold by the time she touched it. When it was done, she stood outside the elevators on the 12th floor with Pruitt beside her and the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the hall. Portland in morning light, the rain finally stopped, the sky doing something that might become blue if it committed. What happens now, she said. For you? You go back to work when you're ready. Your record is clean. Pruitt tucked her portfolio under her arm. For Voss, that's a longer answer. The medical board process takes months. The federal billing inquiry will take longer. He'll have representation, and he'll use it. She paused. But the record now exists. It doesn't go away. He'll keep practicing? During the inquiry, potentially yes, with significant restrictions and under oversight. Pruitt looked at her steadily. That is the frustrating part of institutional process. It is also the part that holds. Nora looked out at the city. The nurses he did this to, she said. The ones before me. Do their records get corrected? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. That's part of the audit's scope. I can't promise what's recoverable, but the findings document the pattern, which means any nurse who was subject to adverse action connected to Voss's departmental authority in the last 30 months has grounds for review. The elevator arrived. They rode down together in silence. In the lobby, Pruitt shook her hand and left, and Nora stood for a moment in the center of the Crestview lobby, in scrubs, on a Wednesday morning, with a clean employment record and no assignment, and the specific disorienting lightness of a weight that had been removed. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and clear-eyed and aware that what had just happened on the 12th floor was an institutional beginning, not an ending, and that the distance between a board finding and an actual changed system was measured in years and sustained pressure and people who didn't let the file close. She went to the trauma floor, not to work, to find Terrell Washington. He was at the charge station managing the morning handoff, and when he saw her, he gave her a look that was 60% professional assessment and 40% something warmer. 12th floor, he said. 12th floor, she confirmed. Modified duty order? Expunged. He nodded slowly, like someone receiving confirmation of something they'd been watching build for a long time. When are you back? When do you need me? Monday, he said. I'll put you on the schedule, active trauma. Monday, she said. She was halfway down the hall when she heard her name. Torres was coming from the direction of the residence lounge, still in his white coat, with the look of someone who had been awake for the second half of a long night and was running on the specific fuel of unresolved tension. I heard the meeting happened, he said. It happened. And? The board found what it found, she said. The process is moving. He exhaled, not dramatically, just a controlled release of something he'd been holding. I have rounds in 10 minutes, he said, but I wanted to say I know it doesn't fix what happened, the documentation, the records. I know it doesn't, he stopped. I should have said something sooner. She looked at him. He was 31 years old and had spent 3 years in a department run by someone who had made very clear, through every available institutional signal, that the cost of contradiction was career level. He had not been cowardly. He had been in a system that was designed to make the cost of honesty visible and the cost of silence invisible. You said something when it counted, she said. That's what mattered. He nodded. Not absolved. He wasn't looking for absolution, and she wasn't offering it, but acknowledged, which was a different thing and more accurate. She took the stairs down and walked out of the building into the morning. The air was cold and smelled like wet pavement and the specific sharpness that came after Portland rain. She stood on the front steps and let it sit on her face for a moment. Her phone rang. Strickland. She answered. I heard the meeting is done, he said. His voice was stronger than 2 days ago. The rasp was mostly gone. Wills gave me the summary. It went as well as it could have, she said. Better, he said. Better than it could have. A pause. How are you doing with it? She considered the question. I'm not sure yet. I'll know more in a few days. That's an honest answer. She could hear something shift in his voice, less formal, more direct. The conversation we started, about the program, about what your cases represent at a policy level. I remember. I'd like to continue it, not from a hospital bed. A dry pause. When I'm vertical and in possession of all my faculties, there are people in Washington I want you to talk to. Your documentation, your cases, the pattern here. It's the kind of evidence that moves policy, if you're willing. She looked at the street. A delivery truck was double parked across from the hospital entrance, and a cyclist was threading past it with the aggressive efficiency of someone for whom the city's obstacles were simply terrain. Ordinary Portland Wednesday morning. I'm willing, she said, but not right now. No, he agreed. Right now you should go home and sleep. I have some things to do first. Of course you do. She heard, at the edge of his voice, something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, carefully managed. Callahan. Sir? Thank you, he said, for all of it. She didn't have a clean answer for that. She said, do what the SICU nurses tell you, and ended the call. She had 3 things to do. The first was to call her mother in Boise, which she did from the car, and which required explaining more backstory than a phone call comfortably held, but which felt necessary in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The need to hear a specific voice say a specific ordinary thing. Her mother listened through the whole of it and then said, in Vietnamese accented English that had the particular cadence of someone translating from thought to language in real time, you kept records, that was smart, and then, come visit soon, and that was the whole of what was needed. The second thing was to go to the administration office and formally confirm, in writing, the expungement of the modified duty order and the grievance because Pruitt had told her to get the paperwork in her hands and not rely on the digital record alone. And she had spent enough time watching digital records be altered to consider that sound advice. The third thing took her until late afternoon. She drove to a print shop on the east side, had the phobie photograph professionally scanned and printed in 2 copies, one for herself, one she set aside without deciding yet what to do with it, and drove back to the hospital to pick up a personnel form she needed to sign for the Monday return. She was in the administrative office signing the form when she overheard 2 nurses from the medical floor talking near the door. They were speaking in the half-lowered voices of people discussing something significant in a semi-public space, which meant they weren't trying to hide it, exactly, just managing the volume. One of them said, heard he didn't come to the meeting, just sent his lawyer. The other, Patricia said he's been in his office all morning, hasn't come out. What happens to the department? Interim director while the review runs. Could be months. Who's running trauma in the meantime? A pause. Marsh, probably. She's the most senior. Nora signed the form, slid it across the desk to the administrative assistant, and left. On the way to the elevator, she passed the corridor that led to the trauma department chief's office. The door was closed. There was no light under it. She kept walking. The thing about watching a person's institutional position collapse was that it didn't look like the movies. There was no dramatic confrontation, no single moment of public reckoning. It looked like a closed door and a light that wasn't on. It looked like a lawyer at a meeting the person didn't attend. It looked like administrative assistants giving each other careful looks in the hallway and a personnel form with a new signature in a conference room on the 12th floor where the word significant was used 3 times and the room got quieter each time. The collapse was real. The consequences were real. They just arrived in the language of institutions, slowly, in documentation, with process and timeline, rather than the language of drama. She understood that. She had learned to work in that gap. She was almost to the elevator when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't have saved, which turned out, when she read the message, to be from Raymond Solis of the Oversight Board. Thought you should know. Federal contractor auditor contacted us this afternoon, independent of our process. They've been looking at billing irregularities across 3 Pacific Northwest hospital systems for 8 months. Crestview came up in their data. They'll be in contact with you. She stood at the elevator. 8 months. The federal audit had been running for 8 months, independently, which meant the financial dimension of what Voss had built was not a local anomaly. It was part of a pattern that someone had been tracing from the outside, through data, through billing codes and reimbursement claims, and the kind of statistical analysis that found anomalies in aggregate numbers long before anyone looked at individual cases. Her 47 incidents had not been what broke this open. They were corroboration for something that was already breaking. She rode down. She sat in her car in the parking structure for a moment. She thought about the specific shape of what she had walked into 14 months ago, not knowing what it was. She had been hired into a department that was generating fraudulent billing claims and needed the clinical record managed carefully to support those claims. She had been experienced enough to identify the gaps in the record. She had been inconvenient enough to document them. And so Voss had spent 14 months managing her, slowly, institutionally, with the patience of someone who believed that the system would absorb her objections if he simply kept applying pressure. He had been wrong about that, but he had been right that it would take time. She started the car. She was pulling out of the parking structure when her phone rang through the car speakers. The number was Crestview's main line. She answered, "Nurse Callahan." It was Terrell Washington. "I know you're off today, but I need to tell you something before you hear it somewhere else." She pulled to the exit and stopped. "What is it?" Voss came out of his office at 4 p.m. Terrell's voice was level. He went to the trauma floor. I went to the charge station and he told the staff on duty. A pause that lasted long enough for her to understand something was being managed carefully. He told them that the audit findings were preliminary and contested, and that the department would be returning to normal operations, and that any staff member who had filed statements with the Oversight Board should be aware that there were professional consequences for providing false information to an outside regulatory body. She sat very still. "He said that," she said, "in front of 7 staff members, 2 of whom have already called HR. What happened after?" Dr. Marsh came out of Bay 1 and told him calmly, in front of the same 7 staff members, that he had been relieved of his authority over the department pending the review outcome, that any attempt to exercise departmental authority during that period was outside the scope of his current standing, and that, if he had questions about the process, he should direct them to Holloway's office. A pause. And then she went back into Bay 1. Nora closed her eyes for a moment. "Is he still on the floor?" "No, he left, but Nora—" Terrell's voice shifted. "Before he left, he stopped at the charge station and pulled up the duty roster for Monday, yours specifically." Another pause. "He put a flag on your file. In the system. I've already called HR and they're pulling it, but he still had system access at that point. And the flag, what does it say?" The pause this time was the longest one. "It says you falsified documentation during the mass casualty intake," Terrell said. "Specifically, that your case notes from Bay 3 contain clinical assessments that exceed your scope of practice and were entered retroactively to create a false record of nursing competency." She looked at the exit gate of the parking structure. "He filed that flag after the board meeting," she said, 40 minutes ago. "With full knowledge of the audit findings." Yes. She thought about that. A man whose department was under federal scrutiny for records falsification, whose clinical authority had been suspended, who had been absent from a board meeting that produced findings documenting a 26-month pattern of institutional misconduct. That man had walked onto the trauma floor and filed a falsification allegation against the primary witness to his conduct. "Terrell," she said, "who has access to the timestamp log for system entries?" "IT and compliance." Can you get me the exact time that flag was entered? Already asked for it, he said. They're pulling it now. Send it to me when you have it. You know what he's doing, Terrell said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. He's trying to create a counter record. If he can put a falsification allegation in my file before the federal auditors make contact, he has something to point to, something that muddies the picture. Will it work? She put the car in drive. No, she said. But I want the timestamp documented. I want it in writing that he filed that flag at 4:42 p.m. on the day of the board meeting. She pulled out of the structure into the street. It's not a defense. It's evidence of something else. She drove 2 blocks before she understood what was making her hands tighten on the wheel. Not anger. Something more specific. The recognition that Voss, cornered, had made the one move that revealed exactly how completely he had misread her for 14 months. He had looked at her documentation, her records, her 47-incident file, and he had decided that the right response was to file a counter-allegation of falsification against someone who had kept contemporaneous records of every clinical interaction for 14 months, against someone whose case notes from the mass casualty intake were corroborated by Terrell Washington's mass casualty log, by Kwame Asante's procedure records, by Sandra Marsh's attending notes, and by the Bay 3 monitoring system's automatically generated data timestamps that were created by the machines and therefore could not have been retroactively altered by a nurse. He had spent 14 months underestimating her. In the last hour, cornered and frightened and out of institutional cover, he had done it one final time. Her phone buzzed. Terrell, via text. Timestamp confirmed. Flag entered 4:42 p.m. Sending you the IT log now. She pulled over, read the log, and forwarded it immediately to Pruitt, to Holt, and to Solis. Then she forwarded it to Wills with a single line. He just handed us the last piece. Wills replied in 40 seconds. I see it. Pruitt's already on the phone with the federal team. She sat in the parked car on a side street in Portland, rain starting again against the windshield, the ordinary sounds of the city around her. She thought about the flag in her file. She thought about the timestamp. She thought about a man who had spent 18 years building an institutional fortress out of attribution and documentation and the strategic management of records, and who, in the moment his fortress began to fall, had reached for the same tool he had always used, apparently unable to conceive that it would not work this time, that the records this time were not his to manage, that they never had been. She pulled back into traffic. She drove home. On the kitchen table, under a coffee mug she had not put away that morning, there was a piece of paper she had not noticed when she left. She picked it up. It was the second copy of the Phobie photograph from the print shop. She must have set it down without thinking when she came in last night. She held it in both hands and looked at it. The forward operating base, the harsh light, the 2 figures, one injured, one working. She set it on the windowsill next to the first copy. Then she poured a glass of water, sat down at the table, and picked up her phone to return a call from her mother that she had missed while driving. It rang twice. Her mother picked up. I forgot to ask, her mother said without preamble. The general who was your patient, is he going to be okay? Yes, Nora said. He's going to be okay. Good. A pause with the texture of someone arranging their next thought. And you? She looked at the 2 photographs on the windowsill. Yes, she said. I think so. Her mother made a sound of satisfaction that was also, underneath it, relief. Come visit, she said again. Soon, Nora said. She meant it. What she didn't know yet, what she would find out the following morning when Pruitt called at 7:15 a.m. with a voice that was professionally level in a way that barely covered the urgency underneath, was that the federal contractor auditor who had contacted the oversight board the previous afternoon had spent the night cross-referencing the timestamp on Voss's 4:42 p.m. system entry against a separate database, the database of prior complaints, and had found that Nora Callahan was not the first nurse at Crestview to be flagged by Leonard Voss under almost identical language, at almost identical timing, following a formal complaint or external review. She was the 4th. The other 3 had left the hospital. 2 of them had left nursing entirely. Pruitt's call came at 7:15 a.m. on a Thursday that had started like every other, gray, wet, Portland refusing to commit to anything as definitive as actual weather. 4 nurses, Nora said. She was standing in her kitchen, still in the clothes she'd slept in, holding the phone with both hands without being aware of doing it. He did this to 4 nurses. The federal team confirmed it last night, Pruitt said. The pattern across all 4 cases is identical. A formal complaint or external inquiry, followed within 48 hours by a system-entered flag citing documentation falsification or scope of practice violation, followed within 60 to 90 days by termination or voluntary resignation. A pause. The language in your flag is nearly word for word identical to the language used in the flag filed against a nurse named Patricia Seo in 2021. She resigned 3 weeks later. Nora stood very still. She thought about Patricia Seo, who she had never met, who had worked at Crestview 3 years before her, who had presumably kept her own records or hadn't, who had presumably decided at some point that the cost of staying was too high, or that the path out was easier than the path through. She thought about the 2 nurses who had left nursing entirely. She thought about what that meant, not just for those 2 people, but for every patient who had come through a trauma bay and relied on the institutional knowledge those nurses had spent years building. The waste of it. That was the thing that sat in her chest like a stone. Not the injustice to her specifically, that was real but manageable, but the sheer institutional waste of competence that had been systematically removed because it was inconvenient to one man's professional self-image and financial architecture. What happens to their records, she said. The federal team is working with the Oregon Medical Board and the Oversight Board to identify every adverse employment action connected to Voss's departmental authority going back 30 months. Anyone whose record was affected has grounds for formal review and correction. Pruitt's voice was careful and precise, which was how she communicated certainty. This is not a small undertaking. It will take time, but the scope is now defined. And Voss? The medical board suspended his clinical privileges this morning, pending investigation. He cannot practice. A beat. The federal billing investigation is proceeding separately. Given the scope and the duration and the fact that this appears to be a deliberate systematic scheme rather than individual error, the exposure is significant. Nora set down her coffee mug. Pruitt, she said. The 4:42 p.m. flag, the one he filed after the board meeting. It's been formally characterized as potential witness intimidation, Pruitt said, in the context of an ongoing federal investigation. That characterization was made by the federal team, not by us. Another pause. It substantially changes his position. Nora looked out the window. The rain was doing something new, lighter, almost tentative, the kind of precipitation that couldn't quite decide whether to commit. Through the glass, she could see the building across the street, the ordinary geometry of a Portland morning, people moving on the sidewalk with their specific, purposeful urgency. Is there anything you need from me today? She said. No, Pruitt said. Today, nothing. The process is running. You've given it everything it needs. A pause that was slightly different from the professional pauses, softer at the edges. Go back to work when you're ready. That's the most useful thing you can do right now. She ended the call. She showered. She made actual breakfast, which was eggs and toast, imperfect in the specific way of eggs made by someone not paying full attention. She ate standing at the counter because she had not yet developed the habit of sitting at the table for meals alone, and some habits were harder to build than others. She thought about Monday. She thought about the trauma floor in Terrell's schedule, and the cases that would come through the doors regardless of what had happened on the 12th floor, or in board conference rooms, or in federal database cross-references. The patients didn't care about any of that. They arrived broken and frightened and dependent on the people in that building to know what to do with them. And the people in that building had to know, and the knowing had to be something the institution supported rather than suppressed. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not her own vindication, though she was aware quietly that the vindication was real and that pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But the structural question underneath it, the one Strickland had named from his hospital bed, the one that the 4 nurses represented, the one that her 47 incident file documented from the inside. She finished breakfast. She went to her desk and opened her laptop and spent 2 hours writing a document that was not a complaint and not a legal filing, but something she had been turning over in her mind for several days. A structured account of her experience at Crestview, written not for the Oversight Board but for a different audience. Other nurses. Other veterans entering civilian medicine. Other people who had walked into institutions carrying knowledge that the institution's credentialing system had no good way to recognize, and who had made the choice between silence and consequence, and had not always chosen correctly because the cost of the correct choice had been made prohibitive. She wrote it plainly, without drama. She wrote about what it felt like to know the right answer and be told that knowing it was outside your scope. She wrote about documentation as a survival strategy. She wrote about the specific discipline of patience in a system that was working against you, not the noble patience of someone who has decided to be better than their circumstances, but the practical patience of someone who understands that the record matters and that the record takes time to build, and that time is the thing you have to be willing to spend. She wrote about the two nurses who had left nursing. She didn't know their names, she didn't need to. Their absence from the profession was the point. She finished the document in its rough form and saved it without sending it anywhere yet. It wasn't done. It would need revision. There were things in it she hadn't found the right words for, and things she'd said too directly, and things she'd understated out of a habit of understatement that she was aware was sometimes a strength and sometimes a failure. She closed the laptop. She called Strickland. He answered on the second ring. "You heard about the privileges suspension." "Yes," she said. "I also heard about the other 3 nurses." A brief silence. "Patricia Seo reached out to the board this morning. She saw the news coverage." "There was news coverage?" "Local," he said. "The billing irregularity angle got picked up. Crestview is a significant institution. It's not front page, but it's not buried." Another pause. "SEO is a nurse practitioner now at a clinic in Tacoma. She said she spent 2 years thinking she had done something wrong." Nora closed her eyes for a moment. 2 years, she said. "Yes." His voice was flat in a way that contained something she recognized as controlled anger, the kind that had been sitting somewhere for long enough to have lost its heat, but not its weight. Which is why the policy conversation matters. Because the individual cases resolve, or they don't, not always, not for everyone. But the structural condition that creates them keeps running until someone changes it at the level where it can actually be changed. "Washington," she said, "when I'm cleared to travel." He paused. "Which my doctors are telling me is 6 weeks, and which I am telling them is 4, and which will probably turn out to be 5. A dry pause. "I want you in the room when I make the case, not as a witness, as someone who understands the argument from the inside." "I'll be there," she said. She meant that too. She went back to work on Monday. The trauma floor at 7 a.m. looked exactly the way it always looked. The overhead lights, the linoleum, the particular organized chaos of a shift change in a facility that did not stop running between changes. Terrell was at the charge station, reviewing the overnight cases, and when she came in, he did not make a ceremony of it. He handed her the morning's assignment board and said, "Bay 2 has a post-surgical query that needs a fresh set of eyes." And that was the entirety of the welcome back. It was exactly right. She worked the morning without incident, which was not the same as without difficulty. There was a pediatric case in the afternoon that ran longer and harder than anticipated, a medication error caught and corrected in Bay 4, a family in the waiting room that needed more time and more honesty than anyone had bandwidth for. But there was no friction that came from somewhere above her, no ambient pressure of an authority that wanted her diminished. The floor ran on its own logic, the logic of people who were sick and people who knew how to help them. And she was one of the latter and the former kept arriving, and that was the fundamental transaction that everything else was supposed to serve. Torres found her at the documentation station at 3:15 p.m. "Marsh wants to see the whole trauma team at 4, he said. "Not a case review," she said. I think it's about the department structure going forward." Marsh had been appointed interim director 3 days ago. She had announced it in a single email to department staff that was 4 sentences long and contained no commentary on the circumstances that had made it necessary. The 4 p.m. meeting was in the trauma conference room, which held 12 people comfortably and was currently holding 17, which meant some people were standing along the walls. Nora stood near the door. Terrell was beside her. Torres was across the room next to Asante, who still had the look of someone processing recent events at a slight delay. Marsh came in at 4:02 and stood at the front without a presentation or notes. "I'll be brief," she said. "Most of you know the broad outlines of what's happened in the last week. The specifics are still unfolding and will continue to unfold for some time. I'm not here to characterize them." She looked around the room. "What I want to say is this. The way this department ran for the last several years was not the only way it could have run. We're going to run it differently. That means different systems for clinical attribution, different protocols for how nursing observations get documented and reviewed, different expectations about whose voice matters in a clinical assessment. She paused. Some of that will be uncomfortable for people who are used to a particular hierarchy. That's fine. Discomfort is manageable. The alternative is what we just came through. She looked at Nora for a moment. Not with ceremony, just acknowledgement. The straightforward acknowledgement of one clinician to another. Any questions can come to me directly, Marsh said. That's it. The room moved. Nora stood for a moment after most people had filtered out, looking at the conference room. The whiteboard, with old case notes on it that someone kept meaning to erase. The table with the scratch along one edge from a gurney that had come in too fast 3 years ago and caught the corner. The window that looked out onto the internal courtyard where someone had put a planter with struggling herbs that nobody watered consistently. Deb Forsyth appeared at her elbow. How was the first day back? Deb asked. Good, Nora said. And then, because Deb had been at Crestview for 19 years and had filed a statement for an audit and deserved more than the short answer, better than I expected, actually. Deb nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Patricia Co. called me, she said. Yesterday. She got my number from someone in HR. She wanted to know... Deb stopped. She wanted to know how it happened, how it got this far, how we let it. Nora looked at her. What did you tell her? I told her the truth. Deb's voice was even. I told her that I knew something was wrong for a long time, and I told myself it was above my pay grade, and I kept my head down, and I lost track of the difference between staying out of it and being part of it. A pause. She was very kind about that. She shouldn't have been. She was probably relieved to talk to someone who had been there, Nora said. Maybe. Deb looked at the courtyard window. She asked about you. She's been following the case. She said... A small pause. She said she wished she had met you sooner. Nora thought about that. She thought about the particular cruelty of a system that isolated the people it was grinding down, that made each of them feel individually at fault, individually insufficient, individually responsible for the gap between what they knew and what they were allowed to do. The isolation was not accidental. Isolated people did not compare notes. They did not find the pattern. They resigned, or they reduced themselves to the dimensions the institution would tolerate, and the system continued running on the labor of people who had been taught to make themselves smaller. Tell her she can call me, Nora said. If she wants to. Deb looked at her. I already did, she said. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday that had actual sun in it, the kind of Pacific Northwest March sun that arrived with the surprise quality of something that had not been expected and was not entirely sure it was welcome. Nora's phone rang at noon during her lunch break. Unknown number, Washington, D.C. area code. She answered. Nurse Callahan. A woman's voice, measured and direct. My name is Dr. Renata Webb. I'm the Deputy Director of the Defense Health Agency. I've been briefed by General Strickland's office on your situation and your background. A brief pause. I'm also aware of the document you've been circulating, the one about veterans entering civilian medicine. Nora was sitting on a bench outside the hospital's main entrance, in the thin sun, with half a sandwich she had mostly eaten. It's not fully revised yet, she said. The version I read was compelling, Webb said. The part about documentation as a survival strategy. I read that section 3 times. Another pause. I'd like to talk to you about a project we've been developing. A formal certification pathway for combat medics transitioning to civilian emergency medicine. One that would provide credentialing recognition for the procedural experience they actually have, rather than starting from zero and working through a system designed for people with no relevant background. A beat. We've been trying to build the evidence base for it. The argument that this population brings demonstrable clinical value that isn't being captured by existing metrics. 47 incidents, Nora said quietly. 47 incidents, Webb confirmed. And now 4 nurses, and a department that ran fraudulently in part because suppressing that competence was financially useful. A pause. That's not just a Crestview problem. That's a systemic problem with data attached to it, the kind of data that moves policy. Nora looked at the thin sun on the parking structure. She thought about 8 years, about the fob photograph on her windowsill, about the long discipline of knowing something and not being permitted to use it. about all the different ways institutions found to make competence invisible when competence was inconvenient. She thought about Patricia Seo, who had spent 2 years thinking she had done something wrong. "When do you need me in Washington?" she said. Webb said, "How is the week of the 14th?" She was back on the trauma floor at 1 p.m., working the afternoon cases when Strickland called. "Webb contacted you," he said. "She did." "And?" "The 14th," she said. She could hear the thing that was not quite a laugh, managed carefully. "Good," he said. "There are 3 other people I want in that room. A PA from Fort Bragg, a combat medic from the 160th who's now working emergency medicine in Phoenix, and a former flight medic who runs a paramedic training program in Colorado." A pause. "You'll like them." "Are they bringing their documentation?" she said. "They are now," he said. "I'm going to suggest it." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "How's the recovery?" she said. "Painful and slow," he said, "which the doctors assure me is correct." A pause. "Callahan, the Oversight Board released their public summary this morning. I don't know if you've seen it." She hadn't had time to check. "It named you," he said, "by name, in the findings summary, as the nursing staff member whose clinical assessments were systematically suppressed and reattributed." A pause. "And as the person whose documentation initiated the investigation that identified the full scope of the scheme." She was walking down the trauma hall, and she stopped. "Public record," she said. "Public record," he confirmed. "Your name, in a federal oversight finding, correctly attached to the work you actually did." A pause. "I know that's not everything. I know the record doesn't give back the 14 months. But it's real, and it's permanent, and the people who come after you, the ones who end up in a system like this one, they'll be able to find it." She stood in the hall for a moment. Around her, the floor was running. A gurney moving past, someone's voice on the radio, the distant alarm of a monitor being reset. The ordinary machinery of a place that didn't stop. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. From the beginning." "You did the work," he said. "I just made some calls." "Important calls," she said. "That's what generals are for," he said, and this time the thing that was not quite a laugh made it out. She ended the call. She went back to work. The Leonard Voss situation resolved in the way institutional situations resolved, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a sequence of documented outcomes that arrived over months and accumulated into a picture that was clear even if no single piece of it was satisfying on its own. The Oregon Medical Board's investigation concluded in late spring. The findings documented a sustained pattern of clinical record alteration, false attribution, and retaliatory adverse employment action affecting 6 staff members over 32 months. His medical license was suspended for 18 months with conditions for reinstatement that included supervised practice and ethics review, conditions that the board's public statement noted would be difficult to meet given the concurrent federal proceedings. The federal billing investigation resulted in a civil settlement that Crestview's board approved, with the particular grim efficiency of an institution choosing between bad options and finding the least bad one. The settlement was significant. The terms included a compliance monitor installed in the hospital's billing and records department for 3 years, mandatory retraining for all clinical documentation staff, and a formal review process for any adverse employment action taken against clinical staff who had filed internal or external complaints. Voss did not appear at any of the hearings. His lawyer appeared. Nora attended one of them, the medical board's formal finding, because Pruitt thought it was appropriate for her to be there, and because she agreed. She sat in the 3rd row of a conference room in Salem and watched the board chair read the findings into the record in the flat, declarative language of institutional process. And she felt sitting there something she had not anticipated, not vindication exactly, because vindication implied that she had been waiting for external confirmation of something she doubted, and she had never doubted what she knew. What she felt was more like the end of a sustained effort, the release of a breath held for a very long time. She went home and called her mother. She visited Boise the following weekend. It was the first time she had been back in 2 years, and her mother made soup that was too spicy and didn't apologize for it, and they sat at the kitchen table in her mother's small house and talked for 4 hours about things that had nothing to do with hospitals or oversight boards or federal investigations. Her mother talked about her neighbor's garden and a book club she had joined and a structural concern with the back porch. Nora talked about Portland and the specific difficulty of finding good coffee east of the Willamette, and a resident named Asante who was quietly becoming someone the floor depended on. Her mother listened with the particular attention of someone storing information for later use. At some point in the evening, her mother said, without looking up from her soup, "Your father would have said you handled it correctly." Her father had been a quiet man, a carpenter, dead 11 years. He had said very little about most things, but what he said had tended to land. Nora looked at her soup. "I'm not sure I always handled it correctly," she said. "No," her mother agreed, "but correctly enough." That was probably the most accurate assessment she was going to get, and she accepted it. The week of the 14th arrived. She flew to Washington on a Sunday, took a cab to a hotel that was unremarkable in the specific way of hotels chosen for proximity to federal buildings, ate dinner at a place around the corner that had good fish and indifferent service, and went to bed at 10 p.m. The meeting was in a conference room in a building she had been in once before, years ago, for a different reason. It had the particular aesthetic of federal facilities, functional, slightly underfunded looking, the kind of space that suggested the money went somewhere other than the furniture. Strickland was there, which she had not been certain of given the travel restrictions his doctors had been trying to impose. He looked better than the last time she had seen him in person, still carrying the evidence of the surgery in the way he moved, carefully, with a slight economy of motion that hadn't been there before, but present and focused and fully in the room. Webb was there. 3 other people she didn't know yet. A PA from Fort Bragg named Marcus Albright, a former 160th medic now working emergency medicine in Phoenix named Tasha Brennan, and a flight medic turned training program director from Colorado named Rory Falk. They had all brought documentation. Albright had a folder nearly as thick as hers. Brennan had a digital archive on a tablet. Falk had spent 4 hours the previous evening, he told her over bad conference room coffee, pulling together case records he hadn't looked at in 3 years. They spent 6 hours in that room. The policy people listened. Webb asked questions that were direct and specific, and occasionally revealed exactly how much she already understood about the gap between what combat medical training produced and what civilian credentialing systems recognized. Strickland said very little. He had said what he needed to say to get them in the room. What happened in the room was theirs. By the end of the afternoon, there was a framework on the whiteboard. Not a policy, not yet, but the skeleton of one. A proposed certification pathway. Recognition criteria. A pilot program scoped to 3 hospital systems, 2 of them military adjacent, 1 civilian. An evidence review process that would use the documentation they had brought as the baseline data. It was a beginning, it was not a solution. Nora was aware of that. She had spent enough time inside institutions to know that the distance between a framework on a whiteboard and a changed system was measured in years, and sustained effort, and people who stayed in the room even when the room got frustrating, which it would, regularly, because that was how institutional change worked. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and revisions, and moments where the whole thing looked like it was going backward before it moved forward again. She was aware of that, and she was staying anyway. On the flight back to Portland, with the window seat and the clouds below, and the particular suspension of thought that long flights sometimes produced, she found herself thinking about a specific afternoon. Kandahar, August, harsh light. The sound rang a half-second before everything went wrong. She had not let herself think about that afternoon directly for a long time. She had kept it in the peripheral vision of her memory, present but not examined. She examined it now. She had been 27 years old. She had been in the field for 8 months. She had been scared, though she had not let herself feel that until much later because there was no time to feel it then. She had worked on a man she did not know, with what she had, in conditions that were not adequate, and he had lived. She had not known, for years, that he had lived. She had not known his name, or that he had married and had children, or that a general had kept a photograph of the moment in his personal file for years because he wanted to find her and tell her it had mattered. That was the thing about the work. You did it, and you moved on, and you did not always know what it became. You did not always get to know if the abstraction turned into anything real. She knew now. Corporal David Solis was alive in Tacoma with a family. Patricia Seo was practicing as a nurse practitioner. Becca Osei was 14 years old and breathing correctly. Marcus Webb had recovered. The patients she had managed in Bay 3 during the mass casualty intake were distributed across the city in various states of recovery, going back to their lives, mostly unaware that the specific decisions made in the first 12 minutes of their care had mattered in ways they would never fully know. That was what the work was. Not the recognition. The recognition was real, and she was not going to pretend it hadn't mattered, because pretending that would be a lie, and she had spent too long in a system that ran on polite lies to want to add her own. The recognition had mattered. The public record mattered. The oversight board's finding with her name on it mattered, because the people who came after her needed to be able to find it. But the work itself was not the recognition. The work was the 14 minutes in a trauma bay when someone was dying and you knew what to do and you did it, regardless of whether anyone was going to credit you for it correctly, regardless of whether the institution around you was going to support you or quietly erase you, regardless of whether anyone at all was watching. You did it because you knew how. You did it because they needed someone who knew how. That was the whole of it. She landed in Portland at 9 p.m. to rain that had been waiting for her, specific and relentless and entirely characteristic. She took the airport train downtown and walked the last 6 blocks to her apartment because she wanted the air, even wet air, after the recycled hours of the plane. On her windowsill, the 2 photographs were where she'd left them. She looked at them for a moment. She changed clothes. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and opened the document she had been revising for 3 weeks. The one about veterans in civilian medicine. The one Webb had read 3 times. The one that was almost what it needed to be. She read through the last section. She found the place where she had understated something and fixed it. She read the ending, which she had written in the draft but not been satisfied with, and she deleted 2 sentences and wrote 1 different one and read it back. And it was right. She saved it. She sent it to Webb. She closed the laptop. Outside the window, Portland was doing what it did, running in the rain, full of people moving through their specific and various lives, each of them carrying something the city could not see from the outside. That was the thing about people. You could work alongside them for years and not know what they were carrying, what they had survived, what they knew how to do in the dark. Some of them knew things the system had no good way to measure. Some of them had learned to keep records. Some of them had been waiting, for years, for someone to ask the right question. Nora Callahan had been all 3. She was still all 3. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the rain came down on Portland the way it always did, without asking permission, without announcing itself, just doing the thing it had always done, and the city ran underneath it the way cities ran, imperfectly,